I always knew my family was involved in some strange things. We never celebrated Christmas, Easter, or even Festivus. No, our main holiday was the Overtide on the first full moon after the summer solstice. As my parents constantly drilled into my head, we were Reaperners, the few remaining mystics of an ancient path. The Reaperners devoted their lives to travel. We explored other worlds, other universes even. Many of us died on the way, or sometimes, travelers from our spiritual path would come back totally insane and rambling. Some had even clawed their own eyes out, as if trying to stop the horrors that they were seeing. My father had no real power in the Reaperners, but he was one of the most accomplished travelers in the world. The young male children of the leaders would often accompany my father out to the woods and to ancient cave systems near our house, where he would show them unimaginable things. One of the young trainees, a brash young man who couldn't have been older than 17, came back with totally white hair after a single night in the caves with my father. When I asked my dad what had happened, he simply gave me a sly smile and walked away. On my own 17th birthday, which took place a few years ago, I was to follow my father out into the forest before sunset. We would be heading to Hollowhead Cave, a 10-mile hike from the parking area. My father found the dirt road, pulling over on a slight turnaround. The nearest neighbor was miles down the road. We took no cell phones or supplies with us. We didn't have so much as a knife. We had been hiking for hours. I could feel blisters starting to form on my feet, and trickles of sweat rolled down from my hairline. The insects buzzed and chirped in the ferns and trees surrounding us, and a cloud of gnats followed us everywhere we went. There was a slight smell of flowers in the air mixed with pines. Other than the insects, it was a beautiful and peaceful forest. Finally, my father broke the long silence. "Are you scared?" my father asked. I looked over at him. His strange, gray eyes were watching me, studying me. They seemed to snap and sizzle with inner energy. My father looked younger than his age, sturdy and well-built. Muscles grown over a lifetime of work filled out his clothes. Even though he was in his 50s, he had almost no wrinkles on his face and a few white hairs. Those are eyes that have seen beyond, I thought to myself. Those are eyes that have seen other worlds. The light that seems to shine from them must be holy. It must be the light of 1,000 other universes. "Does traveling really bring enlightenment, Pa?" I said. He shrugged, looking forward again. "It may or it may not. Enlightenment is already here at every moment, just like the same deathless mind is always present in every universe, or the same eternal soul is present in all the seconds of your life. Traveling to other spaces may help you see how this eternal consciousness is the same in every universe, how that endless mind stretches everywhere. It is more of a deepening awareness that you get from travel, one that brings enough wisdom to see the eternal as already here. But you didn't answer my question," my father said. "Yes, I am afraid." It was nearly dark when we got to the cave. My father had been quiet most of the way. Now as he knelt in front of me, I saw what looked like a hand mirror in his back pocket, rolled up in cloth. "What's that in your pocket?" I asked. "I always hold the black mirror," he said. "We use it for training the young, opening up to the idea of traveling, showing them a little of what is out there waiting for those with courage on their side." The cave was cool and refreshing. The torches had been put out along the walls, though I don't know when they were lit. I heard what sounded like a babbling stream echoing up through the rocky chambers. and I smelled far-off water mixing with the smoke of the torches. "What about the red mirror?" I whispered. I had heard rumors about it, but they were vague and contradictory. "The red mirror. We don't generally speak of it. The High Priest, Arkovich, personally attends to it most of the year. He tries to make it sleep. He tells me that prayer and meditation seem to soothe it, but sometimes it wakes up. I'll tell you a story while we walk. It'll make the time pass faster." His voice seemed to crack slightly at this. His face looked grimmer and thinner in the flickering light. He looked at me with his strange gray eyes, and in them, I saw the traveler that my father truly was. He had an iron core that was so fearless it almost seemed mad. He gave a nearly inaudible sigh, and then he started the story. High Priest Arkovich was given the 3 mirrors in a somewhat strange way. He was on a meditative retreat, sleeping outside and drinking from the streams, eating ferns and mushrooms and whatever else he could scrounge. After the first day, he woke up to a pile of dead squirrels next to his head. Their necks were all snapped and they were stacked in a little pyramid. The second night he tried to stay up, but after hours of standing guard, he lost the battle. He says that he fell asleep with his back against a tree. When he awoke, he found a pile of hundreds of shoes surrounding him. He says that when he left the spot to forage or drink, these piles were taken away in the blink of an eye. It was as if they hadn't been there at all, and there was no sign of anyone in the forest. He was out about a dozen miles from the road, far down a winding deer trail. He wasn't going to be spooked by these childish pranks, he told me. So he stayed another night. This time he awoke to find a black box next to him. He opened it expecting an animal's head or some other rubbish, but instead, he found these 3 strange mirrors. He touched them all in turn, the white, the red, and the black, and then he pulled them out. He looked into the red. The flat polished stone on both sides sure made a poor mirror, he told me. In fact, all 3 of them were almost totally useless. They were clearly hand mirrors, of that he was certain. But who would put just a slightly reflective stone inscribed with strange runes in place of the actual mirror glass? And then his mind made a connection. He had heard of shamans doing similar things to this, making special hand mirrors for rites involving psychedelic drugs or mystical experiences, such as the shamans in Africa with their iboga vine. As he looked into it though, he said the strange ruins seemed to start glowing. They sent out red light that pierced straight into his head. He said that he tried closing his eyes, but even with them fully shut, all he could see was swirling tunnels of red light. And then he was gone. When we travel, son, you know that we hear the ringing. Anytime you cross universes, all you can hear is that incessant, high-pitched sound which seems to vibrate your teeth and make your eyes water. I nodded. I had done some astral projection and lucid dreaming, both of which were considered vastly inferior by the Reaponeers, like toys for children to play with. The most advanced in our religion always traveled bodily. It was considered the way to liberation. Enlightenment itself was the goal, and seeing the true nature of all things by travel was the principal path. But some of the older members of our religion had told me that it was also terrifying, especially since anybody who traveled bodily could die if something in these strange alien worlds attacked them. Markovich says the ringing was the most intense that he had ever heard. He said that he thought his head would split open. The red light still blinded him, but he felt himself floating. And then he felt the light receding and opened his eyes. The ringing in his ears had gradually faded as he looked around, realizing that he was in a strange jungle, still holding the red mirror in one hand. But the ruins had stopped glowing and faded back into the stone, and the mirror again just looked like a useless decoration. He says the trees of the jungle stretched hundreds of feet above him with slippery yellow trunks and thin branches periodically reaching out. Ferns taller than a man surrounded him. He could barely see over the thick vegetation. There were no cries of birds, no insects, no animals of any kind that he could see. And then he heard a rustling, just a slight movement. Turning, he saw a blood-red shape duck into the ferns. Arkovich began to run. He ran for his life. He didn't know what kind of world he was in, but he knew when he was being stalked. He heard more of those things and saw glimpses of that bright red hide they had. And then one jumped directly in front of him. It stood over 10 feet tall, with dozens of black eyes on stalks rising from the top of its thin oval head. Its legs were sleek and reptilian, like the legs of a velociraptor, and long arms with knife-like claws at the end. It opened its mouth wide, showing rows of parallel serrated teeth, and from a bulging orange sac in the back of its throat, it spit at him. Sticky white webs shot out and wrapped around his legs before he even knew what was happening. And then he heard dozens more of those things closing in on him from all around, ready to begin shredding his body. These were clearly the apex predators. He was stupid for not realizing why there were no animal sounds now. Likely the life in the area had gone silent and moved on when they realized a herd of those things were in the area. As the nearest one bent down, hissing, silver streams of saliva running down its pointed chin, Arkovich picked up the red mirror. Instinctively, he traced his finger along the ruins, hoping for any sign of life from it. At once, it lit up, blinding him with the red light, and he felt himself floating again, the ringing in his ears. He awoke at his house nearly 20 miles away from where he had started just minutes earlier, still wrapped in webs. My father stopped in front of me. He had just come to a sharp turn in the cave, the rocks jutting out on both sides and making it thin and claustrophobic. I had to turn my body to slide through. I saw my father having more trouble with his larger frame, but eventually he pushed himself through, sweating and slightly scraped up. "Wow," I said. "Where do you think he went?" My father shrugged. "Son, the mirrors can send you anywhere at any time, but the red mirror in particular tends to send travelers to the worst places, where predators or demons are waiting. Other times, people have found themselves on nearly dead planets where strange robed beings floated in the mist. Arkovich's son used the red mirror and he never came back at all. The mirror just showed up back in Arkovich's office after his son had been missing for 3 days. We don't know where they went, and we don't want more people being lost in such a way. And now we are here," my father finished saying. I looked around, frowning. It looked like just another part of the cave to me, and then I realized that I did see something. Out of the corner of my eye, one of the walls of the cave, it seemed to shimmer and glow. Even when I got close to it and touched it, it felt warm, too much warmer than the other stone walls of the cave. It was only the space about the size of a door. "Yes, my son," my father said. "That is the gateway where we will send you through. Your test of manhood will be to see where the black mirror takes you." "If the red mirror took Arkovich without any door, why do we need this one?" I asked. My father leaned in close. "So that you don't come back 20 miles away at the bottom of a lake, or 2,000 miles away at the bottom of some volcano," he said. My heart was beating fast and my stomach had started to hurt. I was having second thoughts. "Okay, let's do this," I said. "Let's see where the mirror takes me." He nodded and took out these supplies for the ritual. With a prayer to the Eternal Mind, he handed me the mirror. It felt much heavier than it looked. Moreover, it was as cold as death. As soon as I had touched it, the ruins lit up, blinding me. Pure white light shot out of them, and the shimmering of the doorway was so intense now that I saw sparks and electricity. And then the wall opened. Every hair was standing up as I watched it happen, as if I were underneath a forming lightning bolt. All I could hear was buzzing. Holding the mirror tightly, I walked forward. Through the doorway. Instantly, everything went black and the buzzing and electricity had stopped. I opened my eyes in a strange place. The sun was warm and the wind blew so fiercely that during the strongest of gusts, I stumbled and feared that I may lose my footing. Looking around, I saw mountains with irons and other metals peeking out, forming sharp, irregular blocks at the bottom. The tops disappeared under thick, stratified yellow clouds that blocked out the sky. Even the sky here was more than a hazy orange silhouette in the impenetrable cold layer. I looked around, unsure of where to go. I could barely see any signs of life on this planet, besides some strange brown moss growing on the base of the mountains. I couldn't ask my dad or the mirror for help, but then I heard something. At first, I thought it was part of the wind, but I quickly realized that it sounded more like gurgling and screaming. I realized with horror that it was in English. "Help," the voice said. "Please, for the love of God, help me back before it comes." I followed the voice around some rocks standing nearly 20 feet high and found a man on the ground, bloody and missing a leg. He raised his head at my appearance and I realized that I knew who this was. It was High Priest Arkovich's son, the one that had gone missing a while back. It was almost hard to recognize him with stringy hair, blood-scraped skin, and nearly all his clothes were torn or missing. But I could still see it in the eyes and construction of the face. "It's okay," I said, leaning down. "I'll get you out, it's going to be okay." "No," he said. "It's coming back, we have to go now." He looked behind me and his eyes widened. "Oh God, it's too late." Without any weapon or even an idea of where I was, I turned to look at what nightmares this world held. The same ones that presumably had torn off or even eaten this poor man's leg. As soon as I saw it, I began to scream. At first, what appeared like the shadow of a huge hand stretched across the lifeless, hard-packed dirt of the strange planet. But this place may have had more life than I realized. With a cry, I realized that what looked like a black hand was just the shadow of the skittering, massive spider-like being that approached us in a blur. I turned back to Arkovich's son, whose name now came to me, Alaric Arkovich. "Oh God, get me out of here," Alaric screamed, his voice booming and echoing through the canyon. The massive mandibles of the spider creature flicked open and closed faster and faster, as if it could already taste the delicious, soft flesh of the injured man lying prone on the ground. Without thinking, I grabbed his outstretched hand and tried to drag him away from the beast, but I had no real hope of outrunning this monstrosity. It towered at least 20 feet in the air and looked to have a dozen sharp, branching legs, each stabbing into the hard dust with every forward step that it took. I grabbed the black mirror out of my pocket, screaming into it. Even though I was young at the time, I wasn't stupid and my instincts were still sharp. "Please, I ask you, God, the one who sees, take me out of here," I said, trying to look into the center of the hypnotizing electrical current that ran across the surface of the smooth and glassy mirror. At first, nothing happened and my heart began to race. The same thought ran across my mind over and over. I'm going to die out here. I'm going to die here on some strange world. The mirror has undoubtedly failed me. It sees my desperation and mocks me. But no, that was the red mirror, the one who had led Arkovich's son to his mutilation, and perhaps had abandoned him. Was it only a fluke that I had come to this place, to what looked like an alternate Earth? A strange desert plain with massive insectoid monstrosities was not my idea of a vacation. And then the mirror began to change. Ruins that had been invisible only moments before now began to light up. I ran as fast as I could while dragging the still living man. I could only pray the mirror would be quick. I felt a strange vibration from Alaric's hand that I grasped. It felt like shaking or trembling, quick desperate pulls in different directions, but my attention never wavered. Within moments, the mirror had sent me traveling. My vision went white and my ears rang, as always happens when we pass between worlds. A sense of exhilaration and pride filled my heart. I had done it. I had saved Arkovich's son. I phased back into being in the Hollowhead Cave, where my father awaited. His face looked stoic and blank, his eyes totally flat as he stared around at the stone. For a moment it seemed that he didn't see me at all. "Father," I cried, "I'm back and you won't believe it. Arkovich's son, Alaric. I saw him and I got him back." I had a sudden surge of energy, but then the whining of the light-filled doorway in the cave seemed to pierce deep into my brain. I almost felt like I would faint. I took a few deep, slow breaths and sat down on the floor, still holding tight to Alaric's hand. My father looked down at me, his face pale, his mouth open in a silent expression of horror. I looked behind me, expecting to see Alaric's unconscious body, but instead I realized that I only held a dismembered arm, a sharp point of a bone sticking out of the bloody limb. And then I did faint and everything went black. I woke up to a feeling of cold, clean water in my tongue. Someone held a tin cup to my mouth, elevating my head and trying to pour water from what seemed like a local stream into my mouth. It instantly refreshed me and my eyes flew open. Thank God I was no longer holding the limb of the dead man. "Well, I guess we know what happened to Alaric," my father said. "He must have used the red mirror. I would guess the mirror returned without him, abandoning him in some horrible place. Maybe at night when the demons of that place are most active. It wouldn't be the first time the red mirror has acted with such treachery. It cannot leave you if you keep it directly on your person at all times, but if you fall while running and it goes flying," he shrugged, "it can decide to return home to Earth Prime." That was the Reaper name for the regular Earth, the one where people built cities and the year was 2023 AD. The starting point for all Reaper travel, as far as I knew, unless Reapers existed on other worlds or had started to convert some of the strange otherworldly creatures that they encountered to our secret path. I don't know about those other worlds, but this looked like an endless desert with huge rabid insects. The monster must have been the size of a small elephant, and faster than any animal I had seen in my entire life, I said. "Earl Arkovich isn't going to respond well to the news," he said. "I know he has in his heart still some hope that his son will return, perhaps with wild stories of other universes, but we must go straight to him and let him know. What he does from there is up to him." And so we did hike back to the car, mostly in silence. I was deep in thought, reflecting on my first horrific experience traveling. I had heard stories from the older Reapineers about worlds that they had seen. There were endless universes, endless worlds, and many alternate Earths, some covered in water, others covered in endless deserts, others circling dead stars or black holes in the cold blackness of space. A few also talked about heaven worlds that they had seen, where beings fed on pure bliss and light, where rockets took these strange inhabitants to other galaxies. In a matter of moments, and death and disease had been nearly vanquished by the forward march of technology. They talked about beautiful cities floating in the clouds with silver spires miles high, and elevators that took one outside the atmosphere of the planet to look at the beauty of space without any interference or air to distort the infinite stars. These thoughts passed through my head as we walked in the forest, the smell of pines and flowers clearing my anxiety and bringing me back to the present. Yes, my first trip had been horrific, but I had survived, and now perhaps my news would bring closure to the high priest, who would know what had happened to his son and be able to bury at least a small part of his body. An image flashed in my head, a tiny coffin, a few inches wide by 9 inches long, with a decomposing arm inside of it, a sharp splinter of bone poking out through the torn flesh at the end. I shuddered. I had never liked Arkovich much. He made an imposing figure, standing well over 6 feet tall, his hypnotizing blue eyes staring out at the world, intelligent and determined. But the way that he spoke to people gave me and many others the impression that he thought less of us. No one would ever say it to his face, but he seemed in many ways arrogant and inflexible. However, he had also led the Reapaniers to a period of prosperity. We had received converts from Blackwater and other militias, as well as various converts who had immense wealth in the stock market, or were involved in the running of certain large tech companies. He used this to acquire weaponry, to form his own small army and to increase the power of our little island of spirituality in the world. When my father and I pulled up to his house and told him, at the door to his mansion, what had transpired, his face grew stonier and angrier. He said not a word. As soon as we had finished, he turned away, saying brusquely, "Stay right here," and then slammed the door. Neither my father nor I looked at each other or said a word. The tension in the air felt thick. After about 10 minutes, Earl Arkovich came back to the door, looked at my father and me, and addressed us. "James," he said to my father and then looked at me, "and Tristan. Tristan, your very first travel ends up like this." He shook his head. "I'm disappointed in you and both of you, to be honest." The hair rose on the back of my neck. What was he talking about? "Reverend," my father said, but Earl raised a hand. "Since when do we leave the bodies of our dead in our worlds to be eaten by abominations or fed on by demons?" he said, his voice never rising above conversational level, but instead allowing a deep underlying venom to imbue each word. "I barely made it back alive," I said, frantically unbelieving. Was this priest a madman? "We never leave the bodies of our dead," Earl hissed. "You two will return with me. Tristan knows the world. He can take us back there. I've called up a team to Hollowhead Cave. You will return with me right now." And so we did. And that's how I found myself back in Hollowhead Cave with a team of 7 other men, including my father and Earl Arkovich, planning to go back into another world that very night. We waited for an old man, the most powerful one known for opening doors and traveling. He lived far out in the forest in a small shack, acting like a hermit much of the time and spending most of his time in nature. Yet when the Reapaniers went to find him, he would always come and help. He would teach the younger ones about doorways and portals and try to pass on his wisdom as well. I was excited to see this figure, even though I didn't know so much as his name, but I had heard many stories about his power. While we waited, a large black Reapanier named Samuel, who Earl had recruited from Blackwater, began to sort through our weaponry. My eyes bulged as I saw them pull out rifles with detachable flashlights and telescopic laser sights, as well as many extra loaded magazines and what I immediately recognized as grenades. They were the kind with the pineapple exterior to allow extra grip when throwing them. I counted 7 rifles and maybe a few dozen grenades. It looked to be quite an arsenal. They started handing weaponry around and handed one to me. I took the gun in my hands, looking at its beautiful craftsmanship, feeling the butt of its extendable stock against my shoulder. I felt immediately more comforted by the presence of weapons, even though deep in my mind I wondered how effective any such weapons would be against creatures from another world. As my mind ran through the encounter with this huge, spider-like being, and hairs began to rise on my arms, the gun began to feel a lot smaller. At that moment, the old man walked in, reminding me of depictions of Merlin or Moses that I had seen. His huge white beard extended down nearly to his waist, and he held a solid ironwood staff, the strange wood shining back in the torchlight of the cave. He looked at the mass of us assembled there, 7 Ripaneers in all armed with semi-automatic rifles and strapped with multiple clips and grenades all around their chests. "This is a tall order, Reverend," the old man said to Earl Arkovich, whose face turned into a scowl. "You're the strongest traveler and most accomplished with doorways, old father," he said, his face still twisted into something ugly and unhappy. "Do you say you cannot get us all through the door?" "Aye, and getting 1 or 2 of you through the door before it slams closed is no issue. 7 or 8, however, this will push the talents of even the most accomplished Ripaneer. And you all have your baggage, your gunnos and exploding granados, I see." With this, he gave a casual flick of his face towards the heavy semi-automatic rifles and grenades strapped across our bodies. "Every extra pound we must force through the door will make the chance of success less and less likely." "Nevertheless," Arkovich said, "it must be done. Are you not Mariope Winston, the greatest and most powerful living traveler? Open the door, I know you can do it." The old man had a petulant and almost childlike look of unhappiness on his bearded face, his huge hooked nose trembling slightly beneath his deep and brown eyes, but he sighed and nodded. "It shall be done." The old man, whose name was apparently Mariope, responded. "If God wills, if the Overmind is with us and gives us the power." "He will," Arkovich said simply, taking the red mirror out of his cloak. We all stared in fascination and horror for a minute. The mirror seemed to have a consciousness of its own, one that could be felt in every part of the cave. It was as if a demon had just opened its eyes in the darkness, and yet it radiated a power that was unmistakable and pure. I felt the hairs rising on my arms and head, accompanied by a humming sound, like strong electrical power lines filling my ears. "Put it away," Mariope cried, his eyes widening, his straight, very white teeth flashing as he opened his mouth in a silent scream. "For the love of all gods, put it away until we're ready. Would you use an atomic bomb simply to give some light in the darkness? Or slice off your face so you don't have to shave your beard? Don't treat the trinkets of the other world so lightly." The cave went silent. "I only wish to bring peace to my son, to recover his body and bring it back to us," Earl said quietly, lethally, like the hissing of a snake. "Peace does not come out of the end of a gun, my priest," Mariope said, not in the least bit perturbed. "It comes from the Overmind. Only death comes out of the end of a gun." We all stopped, the cave going quiet except for faint breathing, and then the old man started up again. "Who is the young man whose mind will reveal which world to us?" Mariope asked. I stepped forward. He apprised me, looking me up and down slowly, as if searching for something that wasn't there. And then he sighed. "Young man, you will be central to this opening. Your mind must mix with mine and we must use our combined power to focus on the doorway. You will be the last one through, so your job is ever more dangerous. When the door slams shut, it slams shut instantly. Travelers have been cut in half, I tell you truly. Why, one of my mates when I was a lad lost his right hand. Do you understand the gravity of what I have told you?" I nodded. "Then come by my side and let us begin. The night is drawing on and strange things may be seen in the night over there as well. if it is night. I hope for your sake it isn't. With our guns and grenades now strapped onto our bodies with equipment Samuel had passed around and helped us fasten when necessary, we looked like a ragtag group of rebels. Many of the Reaponeers wore the coarse brown robes common to our religion, giving them a medieval, monkish appearance. Samuel did not, however. He wore brown desert fatigues and combat boots. Standing nearly 6.5 feet tall, his black skin shining and his huge muscles bulging, he was an imposing presence, and I felt the desire to stand near him when any battles erupted. He radiated confidence and deadliness. "Are we ready?" Earl asked, low, a slight tremor in his voice. The rest nodded. Myuuji grabbed my hand. "What is your name, lad?" he asked in a quiet voice. "Tristan," I said. "My father is James." I pointed to him. "I care not for your father, lad," the old man said, not unkindly. "It is you who will carry the task to the end. You are the strongest and purest, and the youngest as well. I will wait here until you return, until I'm sure you will not." He grabbed my hand. "Now begin to meditate on the world you saw. You will be returning there." Earl saw that we were assembled. He pulled out the red mirror, going in front of the doorway in the cave, the one that looked like solid stone, impassable. The humming began immediately, and the poisonous presence filled the cave. But I closed my eyes and I focused on the world. I felt someone else in my mind, and I realized with horror that it was the old man. Myuuji had telepathic powers somehow, and he saw my memories with me. I felt his hand twitch and what felt like a surge of electricity passed through our bodies, but it didn't hurt. "Focus harder," Myuuji said through gritted teeth. "Focus on the door, focus on the world. Open the portal." I did, with thousands of images flashing through my mind, the way the sun had shone on the desert, the dead rocks, the many legs of the spider. I focused and sent this thought out front towards the door. "It begins to open," Earl cried in a loud, ecstatic voice, but I didn't open my eyes. "Focus harder," Myuuji said. "We've almost got it." Sweating, straining, my eyes flicking back and forth under their lids, I concentrated. I put all of my energy into those thoughts and that door, and then I felt something give. "Behold," Myuuji cried as he and I opened our eyes at the same time. "The portal is opened." The men began to run through, scrambling into a dark desert world on the other side of the stone threshold. When the last one was through, Myuuji pushed me towards the door. I was sprinting, seeing the door closing. With one last bit of energy, I jumped through as I felt it slam shut behind me. A whoosh of air ran over my skin as the stone slammed back into the wall. In those last moments, I was still connected to Myuuji telepathically, and I heard his one thought over and over as I went through the door. Once it closed, it stopped, but I kept hearing it repeating in my head, and nonetheless. "You think you go to a desert world? Nay, lad. It is a Hades world, and it is night there. I will wait for you here, but it is a horrible place, and very few will return from such as that." And as I looked back, I saw Myuuji's eyes. In the depth of his power, his eyes had widened, and I saw his pupils contracting and expanding rapidly. His eyelids fluttered up and down as if he were seizing. Strength flowed out of him towards the door, a current that seemed to twist the air, like a rising heat wave from a desert. That was the last thing I saw from this world before the nightmare began. When we came through, it was chaos. The red mirror dumped us in the middle of the night in the worst possible place, as it is known to do. And as I came through, my ears had begun to ring and my vision went white. When traveling between worlds, these things nearly always happened, knocking one off balance for at least a few seconds, as if a flashbang had just been thrown in the area. But as my vision cleared and my hearing returned, I was relieved to see that this planet was Earth. I could tell that much from the constellations and the moon in the sky. Some other Earth, yes. Perhaps in a universe where life had grown strange and terrifying, but still some form of Earth. In front of us stood a desolate camp. It reminded me of death camps that I had seen footage of, communist and National Socialist death camps where people were starved or frozen. Row after row of razor wire surrounded the camp, and a gate stood at the center. It had a sign above it, but it had seen so much sun and aging that the letters had faded to almost nothing. I saw no guards in the watchtower and nobody shot at us. The place radiated silence and death. But there was a smell that came from it, a smell like rot and crap and corpses. Around the camp I saw strands of webbing sticking to various fences and posts, covering the dilapidated barracks inside the camp that looked ready to collapse under the slightest breeze. "Is this it?" Earl asked from my side in a low voice. I looked around. The rocks looked similar, but I had only been in this world for a short time. And if the entire area looked like a rocky desert, what chance did I have of finding the exact same spot? "I believe we may be close. The webbing for one. That must be the creature who took your son." Behind us, I heard people clicking off the safeties on their rifles. We began to walk towards the gate. I stayed by the side of my father and Samuel, letting Earl lead the way. As soon as we had entered, I heard a sound that sent shivers of horror through my body. It sounded like the breathing of a dying man with pneumonia, a raspy, gurgling breath that came from all around us, and that smell intensified immediately. The smell of death blew on the breeze towards us. When we had entered the camp, the gate swung shut behind us as if on its own accord. I turned, jumping, but saw no one there. And then they began to come out of the barracks. They were horrifying beyond words. Children in torn rags with rotten bodies. Long, stringy black hair hung over their faces, and on their striped uniforms, blooms of dark red showed long dried blood. Brown streaks mixed with the blood in their eyes shone with hatred and malice as they approached from all sides. Hundreds of them gasped and shook. They reminded me of pictures that I had seen of children in Auschwitz. Their trembling, emaciated legs barely held up their weight. Their knees knocked together, the bones making a clicking sound. Some had their noses and cheeks eaten away by insects. Black swarms of flies surrounded them, eating their flesh and laying eggs as they walked forward, all staring and rasping at us, the treat in the center of all. "Shoot them!" Samuel cried, the one man who had kept his head in the terror of the moment. "For God's sake, do it! Would you have us all die?" That broke the stillness, and with a deafening roar, the rifles began to open fire. Those in my group on the outside of the circle disappeared first into the crowd of rotting, grasping hands. The cyanotic blue fingernails of the demonic children in the camp had what looked like dried blood and dirt caked underneath. They bit and clawed like rabid animals. One Reaponeer fell underneath a dozen of them. His face quickly turned into a mask of blood as they bit and ripped at his eyes, nose, and mouth. In his last fading moments of life, he pulled out the pin of a grenade and blew himself and all of his remaining grenades sky high. The force of the explosion shook the ground and knocked me off balance. My ears rang as I tried to back up, but found the fence at my back. The enemy swarmed us in human wave attacks that quickly overwhelmed our positions. I fired as fast as I could, shooting into the ground at the head or chest of anything that moved outside my group. I know that I personally killed at least 20, seeing their heads explode from the impact through my scope, the attached flashlight giving everything an eerie, overly bright LED glow. I stopped to reload a fresh magazine, breathing hard. As I inhaled, I could smell the blood all around us. A rusty metallic odor that mixed with the scent of death and crap in the camp to create the most foul mixture. I wanted to vomit from the cloying mix, an odor that hung so heavy in the air that I swore I could actually taste it. But I sucked my saliva down, trying to focus on the battle around me. Things started to go wrong quickly. We had lost at least 4 men that I had seen, yet the waves of attack kept coming. I looked to my side to see Samuel sweating heavily, his eyes wide and wild, a huge grin on his face as he shot as fast as the semi-automatic weapon would allow, pulling the trigger violently over and over until the magazine ran dry. I heard the slight click when he tried to keep shooting the last time and realized that the chamber was empty. I looked forward and saw a potential path to a nearby barracks. "Samuel!" I screamed as loudly as I could. He looked over at me and I pointed to the barracks. "We can get to that building if we stick together and shoot. Then we can try to pick them off one by one as they come in the door." He needed no more urging than that. He turned to my father and Earl Arkovich as they stood behind us, a few feet apart, shooting and throwing grenades. I heard another explosion from nearby, and then Samuel started bellowing, his voice deep, carrying across the whole camp. "James!" he screamed to my father. "Earl, we're going to try to make it to that building." He gesticulated wildly with his gun, pointing it at the building for emphasis. They nodded and we started running as one. Hands tried to grab at my clothes as the bleeding kids closed in around us. We had made it most of the way to the door by this point, and the way ahead still looked clear. We opened fire on anything close that moved, and my father and Earl each threw a grenade at a large mass that staggered and writhed towards us. With a satisfying explosion, I saw the heads of one after another fly off their bodies. But we were outnumbered at maybe 100 to 1, and no matter how fast we shot or how many grenades we threw, they kept closing in around us. I vowed to keep a grenade for myself in case I found myself surrounded and alone. I would not let myself be eaten alive, my skin ripped off or my eyes bitten out. I would blow myself up if it came to that, and take as many of these abominations with me when I went. But we reached the door to the barracks, Samuel barreling into it without stopping, his massive frame splintering the rickety wood into 1,000 small pieces that flew into the barracks. I sprinted in behind him, and then my father and Earl, their feet pounding heavily on the bare dirt ground. I found myself in a pitch-dark room, the only light coming from the flashlights attached to our guns. The room looked much larger on the inside than it did on the outside, and the light didn't even reach the far wall. We had no time to stop and clear the area, however, as the first enemies had already reached the threshold. My plan worked well. We all opened fire, piling bodies up at the door as fast as we could. After a couple dozen had fallen, laying sprawled on the ground in their black and white striped uniforms, the rest piled up, pushing and trying to get through. Pools of red spread around the bodies of those we had shot, and those behind had slowed enough to the point where we could easily pick them off one by one. "It's just like the Spartans in the Battle of Thermopylae," Samuel said. He looked over at me. "They can't easily get through because of the narrow entrance, so it allows us to ambush and kill them in small groups, rather than taking on the whole mass of them. Kid, I think you saved our lives." I smiled over at him. By this point, so many bodies blocked the doorway that the ones behind couldn't possibly get through. The thin, twisted bodies piled up 3 or 4 high, all the way from directly inside the door of the barracks to 10 feet beyond it. Of course, this also meant that we couldn't easily get out, and soon that became a problem. We checked the rest of the barracks for any signs of movement, traps, or creatures. It looked totally clear. In the back half of the barracks lay bunk after bunk, all made of cheap plywood. A single bunk had 3 levels and a person could slide into each and lay down. The space would not allow someone to raise their head, however. They would have to shimmy back out. The space above the first and second bed looked to be only about 18 inches tall. The person on top had no such issue since the top level was open. And behind these hundreds of bunks, I kept seeing shadows move. I cleared the area as fast as I could, but with only the flashlight and the gun for light, it still took a few minutes. And I gaped at how many beds lay here. They must have crammed all the kids together like sardines. Each bunk only had a space of an inch or two to the next, and I couldn't have even slept on such a narrow wooden platform unless I slept on my side. I saw no pillows, no blankets, and no sheets anywhere. I returned to my father and Earl, sighing. Samuel walked through the inside of the barracks, checking the walls for any holes or secret doors or anything else that could surprise us. He found nothing, and then we were four again, standing in front of the pile of bodies. My father brought out some peanut butter crackers from his jacket, passing around a sealed, snack-sized packet to each of us. I realized just how hungry I was when my hands had wrapped around it. Ripping it open, I started eating the peanut butters quickly. Earl Arkovich had bottles of water that he had secured in a small pack, and we each got one. Though to my disappointment, I saw they were these small half bottles. I knew that I would finish that in a single swallow. "We need a plan," Samuel said, a 1,000-yard stare in his eyes as he stared beyond the front wall of the barracks into something that only he could see in his mind. "Yeah," my father said. "This is a nightmare. We've already lost 4 men." "Come on, James," Earl said to my father. "We don't know for sure that all 4 have died. It's possible some got away. I saw those possessed or undead kids or whatever they are rip off one of their faces and eat it," I whispered. My voice carried in the darkness. "I saw them eat his eyes." Yes, it's very sad," Earl said in a calm, flat voice. "But our plan needs to be that a couple men should cover the door while Earl brings out the red mirror. The other can help him in whatever way he needs. We need to evacuate as soon as possible," my father said. Earl's eyes looked like they might bug out of his head. "We haven't even found my son's body yet," he said, his voice rising in anger and indignation. "How can you possibly want to leave? That is utter cowardice." "No," Samuel said, ripping his eyes away from that unknown point in the distance and looking straight at our high priest. "No, he's right. We need to leave, the sooner the better." Earl looked around amazed, as if he had expected to see hidden cameras in the room. And then he stood up as tall as he could, whacked his right fist on his chest and grinned. That grin did not look like his normal one. It made him look insane and unhinged. At that moment, I wondered how much his son's death had really affected him. I felt sure that his madness would lead us all to our doom, if we allowed it. We all sat in silence, staring at each other for a moment when somebody grabbed my father from behind. It was so black that I hadn't noticed it approaching in the shadows behind him, as my attention had been focused on the high priest. But when my father had started shrieking and calling for help, we all raised our guns. One of the black spider creatures had gotten in somehow. This one looked much smaller than the one that I had seen kill Alaric Arkovich. It was no taller than a man, but it had the same dozen skittering legs, the same huge mandibles extending from its face, constantly tasting the air as they opened and closed in rapid succession. It used these mandibles, sharp and long and curving, to grab my father by his leg and drag him quickly away. The speed at which these small ones skittered was eerie. I instantly raised my gun to try to shoot, but it moved so fast that I had barely no time. I fired a single shot which went high, and then the spider had taken my father down a hidden tunnel in the back of the barracks, disappearing from view. "No!" I screamed. "We have to go get him." The other 2 men still looked somewhat shocked. Earl's eyes had gone wide, while Samuel had shifted from leg to leg uncomfortably, running his huge hand over his shaved head repeatedly. Sweat poured down his face, and to my horror, I saw that he looked scared. The same man who had been a soldier and mercenary in countless war zones. He was scared. Yeah, you're right, Samuel said. Now we can't leave. God dang it. We should have left immediately as soon as we had blocked the door. This place is a death trap. He shot an angry glance at Earl Arkovich. Samuel looked like he wanted to strangle the man. Earl didn't even seem to notice. His eyes had glazed over and he seemed to stare at nothing. Let's do this, Samuel said, grabbing Earl by the shoulder and pulling him forward. We all started running. The hole in the ground didn't even look large enough for the spider to have gone through, though I assumed it could squeeze and morph its body into tight spaces, just like many insects on Earth. I wasn't surprised that nobody had seen the trapdoor. Dirt and filth absolutely covered every square inch of the floor of the barracks, and the seams of the wooden door fit perfectly into the rest of the floor. Underneath all that debris, nobody would have seen the seams anyway, even if we had far more light. The tunnel had been carved right out of the packed dirt. A man could walk through it if he crouched. Samuel might have trouble since he was extremely tall, but Earl and I wouldn't have much issue. I went first and started sprinting as fast as I could, hoping to catch up with my father. I heard the other two drop down in the dirt behind with a dull thud and the pounding of their steps. I didn't look back, but only focused on navigating the winding dirt tunnel. It seemed to go on forever. After about 10 minutes of running, crouched down and carrying my gun and gear, I was tired. But I kept pushing myself, remembering the screaming face of my father. I kept hoping it wasn't too late. After 15 minutes of running, the tunnel opened up into a cavern filled with rocks. I could stand up straight again. The ceiling extended 20 feet above me with filthy drops of water dripping down on my head and making the rocky floor slippery. I saw remnants of what looked like spiderwebs sticking to the walls, wispy and falling apart as if ancient. A few seconds later, Earl and Samuel emerged behind me. With the opening of the tunnel, we could walk side by side. If we had to start shooting, then moving in a line didn't seem wise. The cavern continued to open up, until my flashlight no longer illuminated the ceiling far above me. The floor stretched hundreds of feet to my left and right, with sharp, rocky projections standing straight up. Water continued to drip down the walls and fall from the ceiling, and we had to slow our pace so as to not slip on the slick and wet ground. I saw pieces of webbing sticking to the cliff-like walls, and these looked much fresher. Most were just individual strands hanging down, as thick as an arm and stretching dozens of feet long. I knew what had made those, and I dreaded having to meet them again. Up ahead, I heard shrieking and cries for help. I ran forward, seeing the silhouette of my father suspended in the air a couple of 100 feet away, held in place by the thick strands of sticky web hanging down from each crevice in the wall. It didn't form a traditional spiderweb, but rather just many interlaced strands hanging down dozens of feet. I saw lifeless bodies further ahead, totally wrapped from head to foot in the white strands. "God help me," my father cried down to us. "Where are they?" Samuel yelled over to him. My father shook his head violently. I don't know, just please help me." I looked up at him, realizing how difficult it would be to get him down. He hung over a dozen feet in the air, suspended with his arms out in a T, reminding me of statues of Jesus on the crucifix. Samuel pulled gingerly at a thick strand of spiderwebbing that hung down in front of my father. Satisfied that it would hold his weight, he began shimmying up, wrapping his thick legs and arms around the strand until he was nearly face to face with my father. He pulled out a huge knife and began to cut the strands, holding him in place. At that moment, I heard the skittering of hundreds of legs. Looking behind me, I saw Earl Arkovich crouched over a dark silhouette, wrapped in many layers of webbing. He began to cry and scream. "It's Alaric! It's Alaric, my son, my only son!" he screamed, falling on his knees and hugging the body. He threw his gun to the side, weeping. I could see his mind had finally snapped. Samuel began to throw the last of his grenades at the dozens of approaching spider monsters. The first one blew the front three apart in a cataclysmic blast, sending legs and chitinous shells flying in all directions. I knew that we had to get to the red mirror and leave immediately. I ran over to Earl Arkovich, reaching into his robes. He didn't even seem to notice that I was there as I took the mirror from him. He still lay on the ground, kissing and hugging his son. Samuel was in the front and quickly became overwhelmed. Dozens of spiders poured in through every opening in the cave. As my father ran over to me and I drew the mirror up to my face, activating the silver ruins, I saw Samuel pull the pin on his final grenade, holding it to his chest as the mandibles of the giant creatures bit into his chest and neck. Spurts of red went out in all directions. As we were transported back to the door at Hollowhead Cave, I saw the silhouette of Samuel, grinning wildly as flames burst from his body and took the lives of a dozen of the spider creatures with him. Miriop ran over to us, checking us for injuries. I kept screaming over and over, "They're all dead, God, they're all dead." And then I blacked out for a second time. In my dreams, I kept seeing Earl hugging his son's body, the grin of Samuel as he died, fighting and taking his enemies with him. I woke up in my bed, covered in sweat with enough nightmares to last me a lifetime. So in the end, Earl Arkovich got his desire. He ended up finding his son's body, and they may rest together forever, until some abomination from that world eats them, I suppose. I'm trapped in a perpetual horror, a Groundhog Day of seismic proportions. The world feels a little grislier with every reset. I've always known that some sort of higher power must be the architect of my eternal torture. What other explanation could there be? But I no longer simply know of that power. I've seen it. Let me rewind. I'm used to doing that after all. I don't know how many times I've relived the past 2 decades. Enough times to slowly go insane. I've done some crazy stuff in a manic attempt to break free. I actually thought that I could end the cycle by altering the course of the future. During the present iteration, I haven't really bothered. I'm tired. So you're experiencing the natural course of events, I suppose. In the past, however, I've shaken things up. Let's just say there was an iteration in which I invested wisely, became a billionaire, and used my riches to change the landscape of the world. I even paid extraordinary amounts of money to scientists who promised they could uncover the secrets of the universe. I thought that they could fix whatever had happened to me. The problem is that they never truly believed my story. They didn't really try to understand how a time loop would work, so their research was half-hearted. Nobody has ever been able to save me. And before anybody asks, death is not the answer. It just resets the loop. I find myself waking up in the morning of December 31st, 1999. I celebrate the commencement of a new millennium with my family, and we admire the fireworks. At this point, of course, I probably lived for a millennium. The horror of waking in my 13-year-old body with a 36-year-old mind never fades. Well, I suppose I'm probably 3,600 years old. Who knows? I'm certainly not counting. But I always detest reliving my teenage years. I pretend to be a normal child and blend in with my peers. I strive to not say things that would reveal my adult mind. One of the scariest aspects of my existence is the possibility of accidentally revealing secrets about the future. That has really created a problem before. In one horrifying iteration, The knowledge of my prophetic ability led the British government to conduct torturous experiments on me. But a few months after the very first reset, I actually decided to seize the opportunity to make better decisions. Maybe it's a second chance, I decided. I took care of my health, I married the same girl, but I was a better husband and managed to prevent the divorce. I spent more time with our kids. I was a better version of myself. As December 31st of 2022 approached for the second time, I thought that I had done what the universe had wanted me to do. You can imagine my unbridled terror when the loop reset, and that's when the penny dropped. I'm stuck. Madness ensued. 4 resets later, I tried ending myself. That didn't work. I tried hundreds of times in hundreds of ways, no luck though. So I've given up and resigned myself to this nightmarish existence. Well, perhaps giving up wouldn't be entirely accurate. During every fresh iteration, I do try something new to break the cycle. This time, I posted about my experience online. I might pretend to have lost hope, but actions speak louder than words. I mean, I have to be honest, I've never gone completely wild. I've never completely ruined my life. I've stripped and run through the local park, but I've never, say, robbed a bank. I can't sabotage my reputation. What if the loop has ended? Every time that I reach December of this year, I start to wonder that. It's what keeps me from entirely unhinging and doing something foolish. I don't want to endure this infinite torture. I guess that I still believe I can break free of the cycle. I believe in January 1st, 2023. I'm sure all of you will see it. Surely when that day arrives, I'll have discovered a way to move beyond the loop. Eventually, I have to make it to the next year, right? What's the alternative? I can't seem to die after all. Well, that's what I used to believe. After a certain number of resets, I began to notice something disquieting. It started during one particular December of 2022, and it always begins during this final pre-reset month. Something is watching me. I might stroll down the road and catch a glimpse of something in my peripheral vision. On street corners, I've seen a man with eyes that have no pupils. And that's not all. I've heard things that other people say they can't hear. There are shushing noises with no source. I wake in the night, bathing in a pool of sweat, assured that I've spotted glassy pinpricks in the darkness. Sometimes they rapidly vanish, as if the thing has closed its eyelids to avoid detection. Other times, the eyes linger hovering in front of me. He seems to be getting bolder, closer. Last week, I visited an art gallery and I saw a terrifying painting. My wife and friends commented on its beauty. Boundless beauty, my wife had said. They frowned at my gaunt complexion, and one friend even called me a wimp. I suppose it would seem like an odd reaction. After all, the painting depicted an ordinary man. But my eyes strolled down the uncanny valley, gazing at his dreadful face. Something about him was marginally off, and for the briefest of moments, the gallery light caught his painted eyes in such a way that the pupils had disappeared. I found myself staring into the vacant eyes from various street corners in my darkened bedroom. They were boring into my skull. I whimpered in terror. I've been to that art exhibit in every iteration of this time loop. On December 10th, 2022, my wife and friends always dragged me to it, and I'm certain that painting wasn't there in any of the previous iterations. In that exact spot, there had been a painting of Big Ben proudly displaying 11 o'clock. That means things are changing, and I don't think they're changing for the better. I have considered letting go. My fight is fading. Perhaps I should embrace the entity with open arms. Perhaps it has come to release me from this nightmare. It could offer a finite death and put an end to the loop. But what if it delivers a worse fate? Every time I see the glassy-eyed man, I feel my chest coil into a clove hitch. He isn't good. He isn't trying to save me. I need to figure out how to reach January 1st, 2023. And December 24th, 2022. Merry Christmas. The man on my doorstep was a frosty fellow, so I thought of him as a somber snowman. He had not come to offer glad tidings or a tuneful carol. I knew that before he even opened his mouth. I quaked in horror, dreading what he might have to say. "Who are you?" I timidly queried. "Somebody who can help," he responded. "I saw your first post." My breath inflated. I rooted myself to the ground, too shaken by the menacing statement to muster any kind of reply. "Who is it, Jake?" my wife called. "The postman," I shouted. No matter how many lifetimes I live, I despise lying to Vanessa. But the truth is too complicated. There has only been one time that I ever explained my looping predicament to her. She didn't believe me. She thought that I was mentally unwell. Since that iteration, I've always kept it a secret from her. "How did you find my address?" I eventually whispered. "Does that really matter?" he replied. "I had to see you. I traveled a long way. I think I can stop what's happening to you." "Not here," I blurted. "My family's inside." "Time is not on your side," he firmly told me. "I'm trapped in an endless loop, so I would beg to differ," I facetiously quipped. "It's not endless," the stranger coldly replied. "You feel the thing with no eyes getting closer, don't you?" Before I could pry my trembling lips apart, Vanessa appeared behind me. "Hello," she exuberantly said. The man weakly smiled. "Merry Christmas. I was just telling your husband that I must have foolishly left some of his parcels at the office in town." "Right," I added. "In fact, I think we should come down to the delivery office." "What have I told you about ordering presents late, Jake?" Vanessa mumbled, rolling her eyes. "I know," I smiled. "Don't worry, I'll be quick." Away from Vanessa's prying ears, we decided to meet at the town hall, which was only around the corner. Still, the drive to our rendezvous point was unsettling. I followed the man's black sedan in my beaten-up family car. No matter which radio station I chose, however, I was horrified to find that the same song played. Stairway to Heaven. The once beautiful guitar passage now seemed to harbor a sinister secret. I turned off the radio, but silence didn't make the journey any easier. The disused roads of the festive season felt haunted. Trundling behind the mystery man's sedan, I stole glances at icy alleyways on either side of the road. Shivering, I kept expecting to see him. I was too petrified to breathe, fearing that the glassy-eyed man might find me if I were to gasp for even the smallest pocket of air. We parked on a quiet, residential street and went for a stroll. The sun was descending on the nearby town hall and the streets were starting to empty, but I was a little relieved to see at least some signs of life. Regardless, I knew that wouldn't keep the dark creature from me. "What makes time so special?" the man suddenly asked. I shrugged. "We all have it," the stranger answered. "Please, just tell me what." I was interrupted by the jarring sound of nearby lampposts shattering. The night embraced us like a thin blanket. Shushing filled the air like a ghoulishly glacial wisp of wind. I have never been consumed by such existential terror, and this is coming from a man who has been alive for countless millennia. I've even welcomed death with open arms, but that moment above all others truly haunted me. There are things worse than death, after all. Glassy spheres emerged from the blackness, hovering at the other end of the pavement, as hauntingly garish eyeballs illuminated the void which engulfed it. A black shape moved towards us. "Find me after you reset," The internet stranger whispered. Time is dwindling, but the man did not have the opportunity to finish his sentence. His face lost its color. Those glassy pinpricks were suddenly occupying the stranger's eye sockets. My mystery visitor howled in agony, and his flesh had started to incinerate. There was no fire, but you wouldn't know that from the sight and smell of the man's disintegrating flesh. Blackened strips of skin peeled from his skeleton. His wall was that of a dying animal, desperately crying for a savior that it prayed would emerge from the darkness. Nothing came to save the man. Collapsing to his knees, his clothes shriveling atop his melting flesh, the stranger's cries mutated into hoarse whispers. I saw his tongue wither in his open mouth. I think he tried to say something with his final breath, but all that he could achieve was the most horrific moan. He was reduced to the blood-red meat beneath his skin. I suppose there were still gauntly eyes lodged in his skull. They weren't his eyes, though. Bereft of life, the man toppled to the ground. From his burnt body, a specter ascended. Those soulless pinpricks materialized in the shadowy darkness, gazing into my soul. The glassy-eyed man did not speak. I, on the other hand, could not speak. Suddenly, there was pain. Inconceivable pain. I tentatively peered down to see a black limb, flesh composed of night itself, piercing my left shoulder. Terrified beyond comprehension, I tried to bellow in pain, but my fragile body could scarcely manage a whimper. When I woke, I was in my 13-year-old body. Of course, death would have been too easy. The man was right. Time, we all have it. Some of us have all of it. And before I could fully process my surroundings, I realized that my body was in agony. Blood was soaking into the bedding from the wound on my left shoulder. My wound was still there. Immortality was no longer a foregone conclusion. The glassy-eyed man could end me. Following a hospital visit with my bewildered and traumatized parents, I resolved to change. I would no longer accept this existence. I might not survive my next encounter with the glassy-eyed man, and who knows where he might send me if he were to kill me. After all, there might be an eternal torture worse than my current one. I couldn't rid my mind of that petrifying thought. I spent years searching for the stranger who had knocked on my door. Unable to wait for the formation of this subreddit in 2010, I decided to simply create it. I posted my experience on there. Nobody came to my house. In desperation, I posted on so many different websites, but I quickly realized my mistake. Surely I needed to repeat events in exactly the same way. I needed to submit the post on December 23rd, 2022. And I did just that, but there was no house visit. Perhaps I had already made too many changes to the timeline. Fortunately enough, I also avoided the glassy-eyed man, but I found myself resetting to iteration 3 on New Year's Eve 2022. I spent another 23 years waiting impatiently, and then 2 days ago I submitted the first part of the post. I worried that I might have worded it too differently to catch the eye of the internet stranger, but it worked. Today he visited me. I ushered him into the living room and prayed that my wife wouldn't overhear us. I hurried the stranger through his persistent riddling. I wasn't going to let the glassy-eyed man consume him. What's the significance of New Year's Eve in 1999? I asked. Do I need to go back and fix things? The stranger shook his head and he offered surprisingly a succinct explanation. A time loop is a glitch in the universe, the man said. The entity is here to end the glitch that caused the loop, and he believes that glitch is you. Something else is trapping you. Think, Jake, what happened back in 1999? And that's when I remembered. My body tensed and my heart filled with dread. Some boys were bullying a kid from our neighborhood, Pippa, a 10-year-old girl who never did anything to hurt anybody. The boys had locked her in the old Hawthorne house, a derelict, horrible place. I stood there telling myself that I wasn't complicit in the crime. I only watched. Inaction is action, I suppose. While the fireworks had distracted everybody at midnight, I slipped back into the house to rescue her, but she wasn't there. I assumed that she had escaped and gone home. Over the following week, however, missing posters had popped up. Pippa was never found. Even more horrifyingly, neither were the other 3 boys who had locked her in there. All 4 children had vanished before the start of the new millennium. I told the stranger the story and he nodded. There are things in this world that defy reason. I've seen them, and that's why I came to you. Pippa needs help, he said. I think she and those boys who stole in that house. I don't think the Hawthorne place abides by the rules of time. The man whispered. What do you mean? I asked, shuddering. The stranger paused. Based on things that I've experienced, I would say it's an 11 shrine. An unholy place that ensnares people at the turn of every new year. Such places exist outside of space and time. Pippa is the force that keeps resetting your timeline. If you free her and the boys, you might be saved. They would be returned to the moment of their disappearance in 1999, but that would be the original timeline, a parallel universe. When I returned to the house, I couldn't find the girl, I said. Why would it be any different if I were to revisit it? I told you, the stranger said. An 11 shrine exists beyond the construct of space and time, but it creates a bridge to our world between 11 p.m. and midnight on New Year's Eve. How did you learn these things? I asked, suspiciously, though I was admittedly a little late. I don't think you're ready for that tale, he said. And even if I were to tell you what happened to me, could I not still lie? You just have to trust me, Jake. All right, I conceded. How do I need to prepare for New Year's Eve? When the man explained that I would have to venture into the Hawthorne house at 11 p.m., I trembled in horror. I've spent Christmas Eve watching my family with teary eyes. Can I avoid the flesh-searing limbs of the glassy-eyed man for 6 days? I keep seeing those lifeless eyeballs in the darkest crevices of my house. Even now as I write, I could swear that I just heard a shushing from our wardrobe. Have you ever squandered an opportunity to prevent something terrible from happening to somebody? Maybe you've been caught in a time loop too. I suppose that you might not yet realize. You could reset tomorrow. It could happen on New Year's Eve, 2034. Who knows? Over the festive period, I couldn't stop thinking about New Year's Eve, 1999. I remember being terrified of those bullies just like the little girl. If I had been courageous enough to intervene, I wouldn't have faced the karmic retribution of a time loop. I am still in iteration 3, and since my previous post, I was sure to make note of the internet stranger's contact details, lest the glassy-eyed man should, once again, reduce my new friend to a smoldering carcass. What's her name? I asked. Harold Langley, the man answered. Harold still wouldn't tell me about how he knew such corrupted things as 11 shrines and spiritual forces. He told me that I already had everything that I needed to know. I need to go back to the Hawthorne house between 11 p.m. and midnight on New Year's Eve. Any New Year's Eve would do, in fact. Well, I could simply wait to be reset to 1999. Then I could stop the boys from ever locking Pippa in the house, I suggested. Harold shook his head. Even if you were to return to the past and drag the children miles away from the Hawthorne house, the shrine would still entrap them at 11 p.m. on that fateful New Year's Eve. Remember, they're already there. The house exists outside of time, much like your own loop. No matter where they might travel, their bodies will still reset to that house at 11 p.m. They can only be freed from within the 11 shrine. Sending me back to 1999 is a convoluted way of sending a message, I grumbled. She doesn't know what she's doing, Jake, Harold gently assured me. Pippa is calling for help from an ungodly realm, and that has incurred an abnormality in time. After a long discussion, I could no longer escape the fact that Harold knew far more about this topic than me. I had spent millennia searching for an answer, and I finally had one. I just couldn't accept that. In truth, I simply didn't want to go anywhere near the Hawthorne house. It imbued me with unspeakable thoughts. Every time I walked past it, I felt evilness surge through me. And I know that every child in my neighborhood felt the same way. The Hawthorns had died decades before our time, but we knew that something was deeply wrong with the building that they had left behind. The house felt like a living, unfeeling thing. It was crooked, out of place, ill-intentioned. New Year's Eve, 2022. The Hawthorne house was exactly as I had remembered it, though the neighborhood was certainly much livelier. There were no missing posters, and the roads were littered with revelers, preparing for the new year that I had spent ceaseless centuries attempting to reach. 10:41 p.m. 19 minutes until I could reset, unless the glassy-eyed man finds and ends me. If Harold were correct, my only salvation would be to enter the Hawthorne house. At 11 o'clock in the evening, the shrine would open. There's something much more frightening about seeing a haunted house in the real world. I have never minded eerie buildings in photographs or films, but the Hawthorne house is the most terrifying place that I have ever visited. I gently walked from the moss-covered gate to the fatigued front door, which was painted a long faded blue. In the front yard, there was an unlabeled stone cross, submerged in overgrown, withered grass blades. There were 3 stories to the neglected building. Dark chasms lay behind the glassy panes, and the attic had a misted oval window. I felt a piercing pang of horror in my chest at the sight of a black shape moving behind the glass. Other than a private property sign on the front gate, there was nothing to ward away intruders. There was no barricade across the rotting front door, and it was unlocked, so it creakily inched open with a light push. Perhaps the mere sight of the horrid place was enough to deter most people from trespassing. I wish that I could have the same luxury. As I entered the Hawthorne house, I pulled my phone out of my pocket and lit the dismal place with my torch, revealing a hallway that led into a ginormous staircase. There was an open doorway on the left-hand side of the hallway, and it led onto the lounge. I strolled into the dusty, asbestos-riddled death trap. In the living area, there was a sofa which had been partially devoured by vermin, but I collapsed onto it and waited. 11 p.m. My heart stopped. I wasn't fading away, and I was still in the present. No, this isn't the present, I reminded myself. The Hawthorne house exists outside of time. Nevertheless, my phone's lock screen displayed 2300, which was good enough for me. I wasn't resetting. That was the important thing. Before I could wrap my head around that, however, I noticed something. The walls were groaning. Chest undulating in terror, I leapt to my feet. The winding foundations of the house seemed to lament my presence. I took a look at the world outside of the mucky lounge windows. My dimly lit neighborhood was rapidly vanishing from view. Within seconds, everything beyond the exterior of the house was black. The bridge to the physical realm was gone. Though time was a foreign concept in that shrine to evil, I still felt that it shouldn't be wasted. I had no idea what happened to the children, and I had no idea what was about to happen to me. I needed to find them, and then I could focus on finding a way to reopen the bridge and escape. I don't know how to exit an 11 shrine, Harold had quietly admitted to me. Time works differently in there. I think it only opens a bridge to our world when it wants to do so. So I suppose you have to give it something that it wants more than Pippa and those boys. Those words rang in my head. I found myself meandering in the living room of that lost house. There was a large frame above the fireplace. Using my phone light, I studied the unnerving canvas that loomed above me. It was a painting of the Hawthorne house in its bygone glory days. I didn't recognize the three people standing in front of the house, but I assumed it had to be the Hawthorne family. The mother and father were prim and proper. They must have lived in the 1940s, judging by their fashion, but I wasn't really looking at them. I was looking at their boy. He was a skeletal thing. His flesh seemed to cling tightly to the outline of his skull. The indignant expression on his face was communicated through joyless eyes and thin lips. He had a complexion that was almost wholly white, and that strangely gave the jubilant expressions of his parents' faces a sinister undertone. Why were they so happy? Their son appeared half dead. Needless to say, the painting absolutely horrified me, but everything in that house horrified me. The swirling, nightmarish colors of the artwork felt like a fever dream. In the pristine oval windows at the top of the painted house, there was movement. The paint was actually moving. Unlike the movement that I had seen in the real-life oval window, these painted shapes were crystal clear. Pippa and the three bullies. Their mouths were agape, much like the man in the scream, and they were huddling together, ferociously banging their tiny fists on the window. As if that weren't horrifying enough, there was more movement in the picture. The painted mother turned around and started strolling along the path, heading towards the house. The sun was decaying before my very eyes. His painted form seemed to be crumbling, yet the father smiled and the mother continued walking towards the house. She reached the front door. Thumping followed. And I do not simply mean that I saw the painted mother thump the painted door. There is a thumping sound on the real-life door, which was in the hallway behind me. A blood-curdling screech followed. It was a woman, I suppose, but her voice was no longer sounding human. There was a guttural and distorted quality to it. "Don't take my child from me." I had no desire to hang around and find out what she meant. I sprinted from the living room to the hallway, praying that the front door would hold, and I held my body up the rotting stairs, 2 at a time. Plunging into the darkness, I prepared for the door to fly from its hinges. The thing for which I did not prepare for was suddenly finding myself standing on a well-lit, refurbished landing. The Hawthorne house had suddenly transformed into a lavish home. From the top of the staircase, I turned to face the downstairs hallway. The banging on the front door had ceased, and it opened to reveal the mother. She was an ordinary person, not a frightening apparition. I realized that I had wandered through a portal in time. I would say that my initial guess had been accurate. It seemed to be a snapshot of the 1940s. "Jonathan, tell Bert that dinner will be ready in half an hour," the mother shouted. "He's not in here, Sarah," Jonathan replied. The father's ghost startled me, though the couple seemed much jollier in this memory. He strolled straight through my body and walked down the stairs. Well, I told the boy that he could only play until I finished taking down the laundry, Sarah huffed. He was with the Dalton boys across the road, Jonathan said, now striding across the downstairs hallway. "I shall fetch him." The ghosts of the parents evaporated and the house transported to a different moment in time. There was crying from a room farther down the landing. As I walked towards it, I noticed more frames on the walls. They were less macabre than the portrait that I had seen in the living room. There were 3 paintings of the individual Hawthorne family members. Seeing an ajar door on the left side of the landing, I peered through the slight opening. The sobbing mother was sitting at her dressing table, which faced away from the doorway. I could only see the back of her body. The father was holding her shoulders in futilely, striving to console her. "I cannot live without him, Jonathan," she wailed. "A mother cannot live without her baby." You shouldn't have to do that, Jonathan promised. I have found a way to return his soul to us. Francis acquired some books. There are rituals that can help, but they come with a price. Any price, Sarah coldly interrupted. And what of the boys who murdered our child? Jonathan asked. Death would be too merciful, she said. I agree. From my readings, I have learned ways in which we could make them suffer. If we could transform this house into unhallowed ground, we could ensnare their souls and eternally trap them here. They would become part of the building's woodwork. We would have to build an 11 shrine on the eve of the new year. There might be consequences for others who step foot in this land, but do it, Sarah icily whispered. The world washed away again. I saw brief flashes of the parents in their bedroom. They were drawing bloody patterns on the walls. I heard sourceless screams, cries of anguish from the children who had murdered Bert, I assume. The jigsaw pieces were sliding together. The souls of Bert's killers were embedded in the Hawthorne house. Sarah and Jonathan had succeeded, but had they also managed to resurrect their child? I shuddered, remembering the ghastly painting of a withering Bert in the living room. Something told me that a happily ever after hadn't been in the cards for the fractured family. The lights extinguished. The fresh decor aged in seconds, returning the Hawthorne house to the present. Well, I suppose I wasn't really experiencing any sort of time period. Everything faded away except for one thing, one person, the mother. She was still sitting at her dressing table facing away from the doorway. Her vanity mirror was cracked and coated in filth. I couldn't see her reflection. Her clothes were dusty and tattered. Her once beautiful blonde hair was withered, and she was stroking it with a hairbrush. Her strokes were so vicious that clumps of hair were ripping from her head. No way, I'm not going in there. I attempted to cautiously back away from the door, but floorboards betrayed me. They moaned beneath my weight. The hairbrushing abruptly stopped. The old rickety vanity stool squeaked as the mother had adjusted herself. I expected her to twist her entire body around to face me, but she didn't. Instead, she simply twisted her head. She twisted beyond breaking point. She twisted her head 180 degrees. What was even ghastlier, however, was the face which gazed upon me. It was decomposing. Maggots swam through the cavities in the mother's flesh. Her lipless mouth opened, revealing rotten teeth. She did not smile as she had in the painting. "Where is my son?" her voice cried. To protect itself, my haunted brain had detached from reality. So when the bedroom door slammed shut, I was relieved and petrified in equal measure. I was relieved to be free of the mother's ghoulish gaze, but I was petrified of what I would face next. Remembering why I had come to the Hawthorne house, I resolved to keep searching for Pippa and the boys. I didn't know what kind of demonic specter that I had just seen in the bedroom, and I didn't want to know. Standing in the upstairs hallway, desperately trying to catch my breath, I became aware of a squelching sound. I cast my phone torch onto the wall behind me. A black liquid of unknown composition had scrawled 3 direful words. "Father is home." Moving my light onto the paintings, I saw Bert and Sarah in their portraits. The third painting, on the other hand, was merely a blank canvas. Jonathan had left his portrait. I heard the front door open and slam shut. Loud footsteps moved with immense speed and purpose, clunking up the stairs. Crying in utterly primal fear, I ran towards the far end of the landing. I opened the final door on the left, hearing floorboards groan beneath the weight of some hulking and monstrous entity. For a split second before I stepped through the open doorway, I caught a glimpse of something in the glow of my phone light. The father was far taller and wider than he had appeared in the flashbacks. His gargantuan, ghostly form could barely squeeze through the upstairs corridor. His decomposing face was much like that of his wife, but his eyes were bloody spheres in his sockets. I slammed the door behind me and locked it. There was a cacophony of fist pounding on the door. The father said nothing. His fury spoke far louder than words. I found myself in a second bedroom. Bert's bedroom, heart still not slowing. The frights did not cease. "Jake," a disembodied girl's voice hissed. I froze. "It's Pippa," she continued. "We're in the hideaway. We've been here for months." "Where's the hideaway?" I asked. The banging on the bedroom door had finally quieted. Pippa whispered again. "Behind the wardrobe. Hurry, I think they heard me." I found the wardrobe on the left-hand wall and I started to push it to the side. It was surprisingly light. Once it was a few feet to the right, a small opening was revealed in the wall behind it. I couldn't see anything inside the darkened doorway, but I had to press forwards. I used my phone to light the way and I found myself ascending a small set of stairs. Of course, the attic with the oval window. I tentatively clambered up the staircase, keeping my eyes and ears keenly peeled for anything untoward. When I reached the top, I stretched my hand towards the door handle before me. Creaking, an icy breath skirted across my left ear. Something was standing on the step behind me. "They murdered him," a voice groaned. I didn't need to turn my head. I knew that it was the mother. Quivering, I lightly pressed the standby button to switch off the screen. On the dark, glassy surface of my phone, I saw the walking corpse of the half-decaying mother standing just behind me. Her gaunt face was illuminated by my torchlight. I screamed in terror, but I was quickly silenced by a gnarled, bony hand that clasped over my mouth. That only made me scream louder. I shook the creature off me, whirled around, and she was gone. Too frightened to spend another minute in this house of nightmares, I proceeded to repeatedly slam my shoulder into the attic door. Finally, it gave way. I cast the phone light into the attic, expecting to be met with emptiness, but I turned to the right to find myself looking upon 4 malnourished children who were shivering beneath the oval window. The world outside remained an endless void, but that was besides the point. I had done it. I had found the girl who had been trapping me in the loop for thousands of years, and it hadn't been a fruitless endeavor. The children were crying incessantly. "I'm so sorry," Pippa said. "I was just so scared. Can you help us leave this place?" "We didn't mean to do it," one of the boys whimpered. "The voices made us lock her in here," another boy added. The third boy simply nodded, seemingly too traumatized to speak. "Okay," I eventually managed to say. "Do any of you know something that could help us escape?" Their eyes widened. "You don't know how to free us?" one of the boys shakily asked. I didn't respond. My mind was worrying. I thought about everything that Harold had told me, and then I realized that I didn't need his help. I needed the help of the people who had created the shrine. "Sarah," I screamed. "Jonathan." "What are you doing?" Pippa asked, horrified. "We need to get away from them." Before I could reply, the wall at the far end of the attic had started to ripple. Like swimmers coming to the surface of a pool, the dreadful mother and father seeped through the torn wallpaper. The children screeched, but I stood my ground, keeping the torchlight on the horrible abominations that were striding towards us. "Is your son buried in the front garden?" I asked. No reply. The emotionless demons looked upon me with their awful eyes. "If you create a bridge back to the real world, I could return him to you. That's what you want, isn't it?" The mother started to walk towards me and I trembled in immobilizing terror. "He should be here with us," she wheezed. "Open the bridge," I repeated. "You can't leave the house, can you? I can return his bones to you, I can give you peace. But you must return all of us to our rightful places on our rightful timelines." The ghoul stared for a long time. The only sound in that haunted room was the blubbering of the 4 children who were hiding behind me. I received my answer in the form of light pouring into the room. Not light from my phone, light from the oval window. I and the children turned to face the real world. Fireworks filled the sky. As we watched with teary eyes, the children dissipated. The outside world in turn rapidly changed. The sun rose and set thousands of times in a matter of seconds. Years were passing by. When the earth eventually slowed, I knew that it was 2022 again. "Return our son," the father wheezed. When I turned to face them, the terrifying entities were gone. I sprinted down these stairs from the attic, bounded across to Bert's bedroom, flung my panicked body along the hallway and started to sprint down the main staircase. Gliding across the hallway towards the open door, I prepared to taste freedom. Scorching agony. Horrified, I found myself engulfed in darkness before being thrown onto the floor of the hallway. I bellowed in pain, feeling a searing sensation across my skin. "No!" I whined in horror. The glassy-eyed man. He was standing on the front porch, obstructing what seemed to be the only exit from this house of tricks. He was little more than a shadow, filling the doorway with his black form and white pinpricks. "I fixed it," I yelled. "The loop is over." No response came from the inhuman entity, no movement. I checked the time on my phone. 11:02 p.m. "It's after 11 o'clock and I've not reset," I explained exasperately. "The loop is over." After an eternal moment, the shadow faded into the blackness. The glassy pinpricks merged with the night sky, joining a canopy of twinkling stars. My strained heart finally loosened. Gingerly, I attempted to leave the house. I took a step onto the porch. Nothing stopped me. I hurried into the front yard and tore at the grass with my bare hands. Dirt under my half-broken nails, I quickly dug my way to the cluster of bones that the Hawthorne parents had buried. Why did they not keep the bones in the house? Did they ever manage to resurrect their son? Why were their souls trapped in the 11th shrine with their son's murderers? So many unanswered questions. I delicately and respectfully placed the pile of bones inside the main hallway, quickly exiting the Hawthorne house. As I tiptoed backwards, keeping my eye on the open front door, I saw a bony hand stretch across the wooden floor and drag Bert's remnants out of view. As I passed through the gate, the door to the Hawthorne house swung shut. That was 15 minutes ago, and I hope beyond all hope to never reopen that terrible chapter of my life. At this very moment, I find myself sitting on the curb, typing my update and staring vacantly at the swarm of partygoers. They're blissfully unaware of the horrors lurking in the abhorrent building just behind me. 11:22 p.m. I've never lived beyond 11 p.m. on December 31st, 2022. That must be a promising sign. I'm free, surely. At 11 p.m., I didn't wake up in 1999. Pippa must have released me. But as the Hawthorne house released me, as the glassy-eyed man released me, I suppose that I'll never have a definite answer. I'll always wince in terror at the sight of cavernous crevices. I'll always be looking for those white eyes. I cannot conquer the unknown, but that's not my battle. After thousands of years, I would simply settle for seeing January 1st, 2023. At midnight, let's hope that I manage to post a comment. Okay, let me start off by saying that I know dang well that none of you are going to believe me. After all, at this stage in time, the idea of time travel is just barely moving from something which is shunned by the scientific community and the world in general, to its infancy of being taken seriously. And you have so many people who LARP as time travelers, who truly aren't, even right here on the internet. Heck, the time travel subreddit is full of them. But regardless of whether you believe or not, I assure you that I am a real one. I will say right off the bat that I won't give you my real name, for the simple reason that, well, I'm actually alive right now in 2023. To be more specific, the past version of me is alive right now, and I can't afford to let history change, for reasons I'll go into in a minute. I also won't get into much information about the future in relation to things such as politics or such, so please do not ask. But I suppose I should give a few rather vague details which may help convince you as time goes on that I am telling the truth. It may help convince the right people that my warning is real. For starters, less than 2 or 3 decades from now, not only have the cures for cancer and other major diseases been found, but they can be administered from a simple shot. In a way, the pandemic we went through helped accelerate their development. We also end up making death more of a choice than an inevitability. Life extension research being conducted right now leads to both the ability to live for centuries, if not longer, but also retain our youthful bodies for as long as you wish, which means many of you reading this might still be alive in my time. I was one of those who jumped on the bandwagon after they had finished working the bugs out of it. I mean, imagine having the body of yourself in your 20s, with all the knowledge and wisdom that you accrue from living so long, not to mention being able to do all the things which a single natural lifetime wouldn't allow. It gets some pushback at first by people who worry about living beyond a natural lifetime. Gasoline is banned by the halfway point of this century, but synthetic fuel means people aren't forced into electric cars, which I was extremely happy about, because it meant that I could keep driving my Cadillac DeVille around. Although many people get hooked on the flying car craze that happens towards the end of the 21st century. Not me though. I prefer staying on the ground. Trust me, mid-air accidents are not pretty. However, space travel took off after the Artemis missions put people back on the moon. A few years from now for you guys. And once the moon base and spaceport was constructed well, it was off to the races from there. Vacations to planets like Mars, along with planetary moons such as Europa and Titan, become regular occurrences even for those not so wealthy. And as for time travel, well, that took a little while longer than anticipated to actually work on, and that's the reason why I'm writing this now. You see, there were many discussions that happened as people began to take time travel more and more seriously. Not only to the future, which could already be done with a time dilation, but to the past. It almost became as much of a race for every country in the world as the space race in the 60s had been. Everyone wanted to be written into the history books for eternity, as the ones who had finally invented the ability to travel through time itself. But people weren't really rushing like they used to, when they only had a century or less to live. Scientists can work much longer, without worrying about retiring or dying. During the first part of this time, I honestly wasn't a part of the endeavors myself. I had more or less turned my life around from the second I realized I would be able to live far longer than I thought I would before. I made something of myself, and without getting into too many specific details, as again I want my identity to remain protected, I will say that I became a best-selling author, an explorer who did everything from climbing Mount Everest on Earth and Olympus Mons on Mars, to using the vast wealth that I made from writing and other business endeavors to create underwater cities, similar in design to how Rapture from the BioShock video game looked. I was living my best life from the latter half of the 21st century to the midway point of the 23rd. But there was something that kept pulling away at my mind all throughout it. You see, I had done so much, checked so many things off my bucket list, but there was one thing that hadn't happened yet. And if you guessed that, it was that I wanted to time travel, then congratulations, you've just won a trip for 2 to Europa. Ever since I had been a little child, growing up at the very tail end of the 20th century and the early 21st, I had wanted to visit the past, I wanted to do things such as attend the 9th annual Cannes Film Festival in 1956, to see Jacques Cousteau's The Silent World win the Golden Palm Award, see extinct animals such as the Barbary lion and the Tasmanian tiger, and travel across the oceans on the old ocean liners such as the Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth. For starters, that was how they hooked me into funding much of the research. You see, a venture capitalist whose real name I won't use, but for the sake of telling this, we'll call Reynolds, approached me as one of his first big investors. He had heard me mention my desire to time travel during my book tours. Heck, I had actually written an entire book series about it. That's why when he called me that day, I immediately shot straight up in my chair, paying close attention. "Son," he said over the video screen on my desk, "I've known for a long time now that you want to visit the past." I saw a smile break across his face. "Well, what if I told you that we are the ones closest to actually achieving it? And if you're willing to invest a little time and money into my project, then I will allow you to become one of the first to actually travel to the past." I leaned forward in my chair. "Well then, I would say that you now have my attention, Mr. Reynolds." From that moment on, I was hooked. I was brought to his laboratory where I was honestly shocked to find that he wasn't lying. They were closer than any of the hundreds of other government or private entities attempting to master it. Even to me, it was extremely complicated to understand, but I'll try and explain what he found in layman's terms. Many scientists right now in this century believe that if you traveled near a black hole, you would experience time dilation. This means 1 year near the edge of one would mean 80 years or so back on Earth, and it was already proven in 2190, when a space exploration which had left at the beginning of the 21st century came back looking exactly as they had almost a century prior. There's also a theory that black holes could work in reverse, operating as wormholes to both teleport and send people back in time. The issue is, it was found that you would need a particle accelerator almost 1 billion kilometers long, along with a stable wormhole. Both were almost a complete impossibility, until Reynolds' team came up with a discovery. They were not only able to use a particle accelerator much smaller, but they were also able to create an artificial wormhole, a man-made black hole in their lab. Naturally, many people, myself included, were concerned about this. I asked Reynolds if there were any safeguards to prevent the artificial black hole from rapidly growing on its own. He pointed upwards at the particle accelerator hanging from the ceiling. "Victor, my boy, the particle accelerator has over 90 million sensors monitoring the hole, which, if they detect any kind of anomaly or rapid growth of its own volition beyond our parameters, it'll trigger an emergency shutdown, which will zap the hole into non-existence." He slapped me on the back. "You got nothing to be concerned about." I took him for his word at it. So dumb of myself to simply let it go at that. But I was blinded by how close we were to being able to conquer not only space but time as well. And in the year 2338, we finally attempted our first use of the artificial wormhole to open a portal to the past. Nothing too far back in time, we decided for a dry run to only go as far back as 1 single year. Everyone, scientists, other investors, even the janitorial staff crowded into the lab's viewing area, anxious to see if the work which had taken trillions of dollars and literal centuries would actually pay off. And it did. To both our utter shock and amazement, the wormhole opened. Through the glass and through it, we could see something displayed on the other end of it. We saw the lab looking as it had this same time last year. That wasn't what made our jaws drop though. They dropped because we saw ourselves. I could see myself being led around the chamber by Reynolds and his team, detailing me on the advancements that we were now seeing the results of. I turned to Reynolds, finding him staring at the sight before us with such a sense of pride and accomplishment. I felt my own grin begin to stretch across my face. "It's actually possible," I thought ecstatically in my head. After so many centuries of hoping, it's actually possible. I saw Reynolds turn to me, the man's smile wider than my own if that was possible. "Now do you believe me, Victor?" he asked. For a moment there was complete stillness in the viewing area, and then everybody burst into cheers and applause. We began shaking each other's hands and tugging each other, congratulating ourselves on achieving first what no one else had been able to do. Reynolds then told us to keep what we had seen under our hats. There was a scientific convention coming up in a few years where he wanted to reveal to the world our achievement. We were all too giddy and too busy basking in our own glory to stop to think about the implications of such a decision. Things such as safety protocols and proper procedures never crossed our minds. That mistake was not only the first major one, but the worst. I don't think what happened would have if we would have revealed our findings right there and then. We hit a few snags after that. You see, we could easily open up a wormhole to a few years back, just as easily to a few decades back. Heck, even a century and a half back took a little more energy, but it was doable. So was being able to cross from one end of the wormhole in the present to the past and returning. We created a portable version of the particle accelerator and wormhole, which allowed us to move from the present to the past. Theoretically, you could use the portable pad to keep hopping back in time further and further. However, to return to the present, you needed the main unit. Nobody could find a way to engineer returning into the portable pad. The problem was, the further into the past that you wanted to go, the more energy that was used, and the larger the wormhole had to be to traverse such a long distance. The particle accelerator began to short out at times, causing us to limit our explorations until repairs could be made. One of the investors, Travis, approached me after a meeting with Reynolds in the spring of 2345 to voice his concerns. "What worries me is that if he attempts to open a portal too far back in time at once, it may short out the safeguards, Vic," he said, looking around to make sure that he wasn't overheard. Reynolds had put most of us on edge as of late. If I was fixated on visiting the past, then he was utterly obsessed with it. He never let up on why, but the old photo of him and his mother, someone who had passed centuries ago, gave me a small clue to his motives. But whenever we voiced our concerns now, instead of the placating replies and reassurances, he would snap and almost seem like he was about to hit you. Honestly, I worry about it as well, but what can we do? I whispered back to him. Nobody besides us knows about how far along we are, and if we even try to mention anything to anybody outside of our group, God only knows what he'll do. Especially where the reveal is less than 2 months away. Travis took a deep breath. "I don't care. This is far too dangerous to keep hidden any longer. Somebody has to tell somebody outside." And with that, he turned and walked away. I watched him go, unaware that behind me, a tiny remote security bug had been watching us before scampering away. I mulled over his words for about a month and a half, unsure of what to do. Finally, with only a few days until the world reveal, I decided to return to the lab and speak to Reynolds. Unlike the others, the man was still somewhat friendly with me, and I felt still trusting enough to hear me out. I entered the lab using my personal keycard, noting that he wasn't in his office. I could tell that he had been there recently though. The coffee warmer on his desk still glowed slightly red, and the cup beside it still had steam rising out of it. So I turned and headed for the observation area. As I drew closer, I heard voices. I couldn't tell whose they were yet, and I began to slow as I heard what sounded like angry, almost frantic pleadings from one. I froze, feeling a chill run on my spine. Did somebody break into the lab? I looked down, seeing a discarded metal pipe from a recent repair job, and I picked it up. Feeling every muscle in my body begin to tense up, I hit the button to open the pneumatic doors into the observation room, and I slid inside. Nobody was in here, but I can now tell the voices were coming from the main room itself. I crouch-walked to the glass and slowly peeked over it. What I saw made me nearly drop the pipe. Reynolds stood in the room almost directly under the particle accelerator. Around him were about 10 or 12 of his personal security team. That wasn't the worst sight, though. Oh God. Travis lay on an old medical gurney, the types that you used to see in an old mental hospital from the 20th century. His arms and legs were strapped tightly down, and he struggled to free himself from the restraints. The intercom into the room had been left on, and I could now hear what the voices were saying. "Listen, Reynolds," Travis shouted. "You don't know what you're doing. The wormhole is too unstable to demonstrate it before a crowd, especially where you want to open it up so far back in time at once. You don't even know what'll happen." For a moment, Reynolds stayed silent and then he began to chuckle. It wasn't a normal laugh, though. It sounded absolutely insane. I've seen quite literally millions of horror movies in my lifetime and heard so many insane and evil laughs. But hearing one for real, it made me shudder. He began to speak back to Travis quietly, too softly for me to hear. But whatever he had said, it made a look of complete horror fall over Travis's face. "Oh my God," he moaned out. A feeling of dread began to course through me. Even though I didn't know what Reynolds had told him, I knew that it wasn't good. The man patted Travis on the shoulder and finally said something that I could make out. "You'll be the first, Travis, for my own eyes to see before the big reveal. And nothing you, Victor, or anybody else can do is going to stop me." He began to walk towards the exit. "Goodbye, Travis," he said and then exited the lab. I knew where he was going now. He was coming to the observation room, and God only knew what he would do if he found me here. There was only a single door out of the room, though. I knew that it was far too late to try and escape through it. The unhinged man was now on his way here, and he would see me exiting from it. A rather large air duct with its cover off for repairs caught my eye, and I set down the pipe as I heard voices approach the door. One thing caught my eye before I climbed up into the vent. An object slouched in a canvas bag, and in the few seconds that I had left, I snatched it up, then climbed onto the table in the middle of the room and finally into the vent. I made it just in time as I heard the pneumatic doors open less than a second later, and I saw through the opening Reynolds and his goons step in and up to the glass. A moment later, the lights in the lab began to flicker and weaken. Horror, as palpable as I ever felt, surged through me. "He's turning on the particle accelerator to open the wormhole." Through the glass, I saw Travis struggle in vain to break free. Below me, I heard Reynolds let out a low, evil chuckle, and then he turned to the man to his left. "Do it," he said flatly. In response, the man slammed his meaty fist into a red button on the side of the wall, and I had to slap both of my hands over my mouth to keep from screaming. Have you ever heard about something called spaghettification? It's what scientists, both now in this time and in the future, call what happens when a black hole swallows an object in its path, whether it be a star, a planet, or in this case, a person. The wormhole opened, and as it did, Travis began to scream. It was the most pained, agonizing scream that I've heard a human being make. As it did, I saw both him and the gurney begin to get pulled toward the opening black hole. That wasn't the most horrible part, though. As he approached it, both he and the gurney seemed to begin to stretch out, and at the same time compress, as if he was Laffy Taffy being stretched and pulled on a machine. His scream began to sound off, tinny. It rose several octaves. They say that if a human being was sucked into a black hole, the process of spaghettification would be one of the most horrific and painful ways to die. I can confidently say that they were understating that hypothesis. It was all over in a span of about 20 seconds for us, but I knew for Travis what had been seconds for us had been an eternity of dying for him, due to time dilation. The accelerator was turned off and the black hole wavered for a moment before vanishing. When it was gone, Reynolds turned to his men. "Ready the plans and items needed for the world reveal. I want everything to be in place for when it's time," he said. One guard nodded. "Yes, sir, we'll have it all ready." The men that I had once considered my partner and friend began to walk towards the door, when the guard called after him. "And if Victor should come poking his nose around here while you're gone?" he asked. I felt a fresh surge of fear and horror splash through me as the question was answered. "Then end him the same way we did Travis. I will not have him interfering in this." "Actually," he held up a finger, "don't do that. Go out after this and find him. Put him in my personal jet and put him in the farthest distance away. He deserves what's coming almost more than anyone else, and I want him to be one of the last to go." And with that, he turned and strode out of the lab. I couldn't help but shake uncontrollably in the cramped metal space at his words, as the guards gathered some papers and equipment, and then left the lab. It took me a long time to climb down from that vent and sneak out of the lab. I was terrified that I would be caught at any moment, but I managed to make it out unseen. I didn't go back to my home, any of my homes across the world actually. I knew that there would be men at all of them just waiting for me. Instead, I did something that I hadn't in centuries, and I returned to my poor and humble roots. I first withdrew all the money and gold that I could from my bank accounts, knowing that I would need it, and ended up taking refuge in an extremely run-down motel in the city, one which advertised itself as an authentic early 21st century motel experience. It was for technophobes, people who were afraid or hated technology, to stay when needing to go out from their homes. While there, I frantically tried contacting anybody that I could to warn them, especially after discovering a typed, printed out speech, something that I hadn't seen in centuries, stuffed into a pocket of the bag. Most of it related to the reveal speech, but the last part was what caused me to try calling anybody in power in such a panic. Even now, the words of what turned into a twisted manifesto still fill me with such horror I can't describe. And now, ladies and gentlemen, I must end this presentation with a bit of an admission. This device can indeed open a wormhole through time. It can allow humanity to traverse time and space, allow us to move freely to the past and future at will. But that was only a side effect. It was not what I secretly designed this machine for in the first place. You see, humanity to me as it is now is abhorrent. It's disgusting and aberration. It has been ever since I was a child and had my mother and father educate me on how evil the species we were, to the environment, to each other, and to the universe as a whole. As they became older and I grew, they passed those views on to me. At first, I didn't understand why they and those like them wanted, and not just humans, but all sapient, sentient life to cease to exist. But as these centuries had gone on, I had come to understand their views. Humans were never meant to live this long. Many of us, both here in the audience and watching at home, were never meant to live as long as we have. We all should have done the right thing and died a long time ago. It's disgusting to let ourselves live on. Every year I kept living was one that I hated. But I know I'll never get the majority of others to agree with my views, our views. And so in secret, I have worked with them for centuries on a final plan, to make the choice for you, for all of us. None of you deserve to keep living beyond today. None of us either. All sapient, sentient life in the universe needs to do the right thing and cease to exist. And none of you deserves to be able to travel through time. This is the moment for humanity, for everything to end, and it's too late to escape. May the universe be bettered by the erasure of all life. Goodbye. And now I should probably explain why I'm telling you all of this. how I managed to travel back here, and why I'm revealing all of these things. It's because I wasn't able to stop Reynolds. I tried desperately for days to get through to anybody in the government to warn them. I left message after message. But just like the government now, it's such a mess in the future that either nobody got my messages or they would ignore it as a hoax. At least, not until it was far too late to stop. Because on August 17th, 2345, at exactly 2:30 in the afternoon, Reynolds walked on stage in front of millions of people in the audience in the remodeled Los Angeles Convention Center, and with billions more watching all over the world. He revealed his machine, which he had moved to the center from the lab, and did exactly as the prepared speech had gone. The world, aghast as it thought it had opened up a new age in humanity's existence, able to not only reach the stars but also the future and past. I watched it on the ancient, barely functioning smart TV in my motel room as I frantically prepared. I saw the moment that he launched into his manifesto speech. I saw the realization begin to spread over the crowd, the looks of excitement and glee melting into existential dread and horror. A few tried to rush him to stop him, but his guards, ones that I realized were also a part of his group, shot them. It didn't matter whether they were men or women. They were shot like rabid animals with no remorse. And then Reynolds pulled the lever. The screens didn't stay up for long, nor did I wait around to watch much, but the little that I did will stay burned into my memory for the rest of my existence. The black hole opened, growing rapidly, far more so than I ever saw it do before. It was a runaway black hole, one which might never stop growing. I saw the start of millions of people begin the process of a spaghettification. The screams of pain and agony of millions of lives ending at once. To them, drawn out for a literal eternity of horrific stretching and peeling into oblivion. Must be what the deepest pits of this world are filled with sound like. Before the end of the day, Earth was gone, sucked into the ever-expanding black hole. Billions of lives were ended in the most horrific, painful way imaginable, and with no way to even attempt to escape, as all of Earth was inside the event horizon. And for all I know, it kept growing. For all I know, it ate the entire galaxy, and it's on its way to swallow the entire universe, ending every sapient, sentient thing in existence. But I don't know. I never saw it. You see, the thing that I grabbed in that canvas bag that day, which sat along with the copy of Reynolds' speech, the thing that I saw which made me snatch it up in the first place, was the portable pad. I guess the maniac never thought again about it, seeing as how he never planned for it to be properly used. And as I witnessed the final few moments of his speech, I frantically typed in a random date, a century before, into the wrist-mounted destination selector. I just barely managed to send myself back in time before Los Angeles was obliterated. It's taken me a while to make it all the way back here to 2023. I didn't dare jump more than a few decades back at a time after that first large jump. I was in untested waters, and I didn't want to accidentally destabilize the wormhole and end up doing to myself what had been done to everybody else. And I found jumping back can physically drain you. It doesn't cause any adverse effects such as cancer or tumors to grow, thank God, but it does tire you out, causing you to sleep for 2 or 3 days at a time. And I should explain why I'm here in the first place. First, I have to say, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry that I was so blind, so easily able to be used for my money to have such an evil plan enacted. I am so sorry that whether or not I meant for it to happen, I was a part of what happened. I'm so sorry that I was allowed in my pursuit of a centuries-long dream to become a pawn. But I have a plan to try and prevent that horrific, evil act, one which makes all prior human atrocities look like Tonka toys in comparison, from happening. It will require a sacrifice from me, however. I do believe it will cost me a piece of myself, a piece of my soul. You see, I won't be able to strike and try to kill Reynolds in his adulthood, due to the wealth and power that he gained from his parents. I already had thought of that when I landed back in the mid-23rd century, which means like all those people here online spoke about wanting to do with some other horrible evil men, dictators if they got their hands on time travel. I must. No, I cannot bring myself to say it outright. Even for the most evil man in existence, I cannot bring myself to outright say what I feel I must do, in the way that I must do it. And I know that it will be one of the hardest things to live with once I've done it, but it must be done. That is why before I do this, I'm making one final jump back from here, to give myself a final chance of happiness and peace for a few decades, almost a century. I'm going to give myself one final gift. I'm going to send myself back to the early 1900s. I'm currently collecting vintage cash and more gold things that I couldn't get in my time anymore, to start a new life back then. I'm going to see the Barbary lion and Tasmanian tiger and all of the other long extinct animals. I'm going to go to the Cannes Film Festival in 1956 and shake the hand of Jacques Cousteau, see his amazing film win that award. I'm going to take many oceanic crossing trips on the ocean liners, and I'm going to do much more since the life extension and age reversal therapies will last for another 480 years before wearing off. And all the while, I'll be preparing myself mentally, emotionally, and physically for the horrific act which I must do to help keep humanity and to keep everything from ending. So all of you, along with your children, grandchildren, and so on, can live long, happy lives for as long as you want. I already wake up screaming almost every night from the horror that I saw that last day in the 24th century. I know that I likely will scream worse after I do this, but it must be done. I'm only staying here another few weeks just to take in a final look at a time that I had almost forgotten about, so please wish me luck, as morbid as that might be. I do need to warn you of one thing though, one thing which both worries and scares me far more than any fictional monster or slasher ever could. There is one element of time travel which has been hypothesized but never proven. One that, even after traveling through time, I don't know about. The theory of the multiverse. If someone were to travel back in time and alter the course of history in any large way, it is theorized that instead of the timeline they're unchanging with it, a new, branching timeline would emerge, one where the change occurs, while the other one continues on exactly as it originally did. The person who made the change would never know that they were on the new branching timeline. They couldn't. I pray to God, one which I still believe in, but so many in my time stopped believing in long ago, that the multiverse theory is wrong. That when I do this, I'll change this universe's fate, this timeline. But if it's right, I'm so sorry for what is to come. I glanced at my watch, 3:15 p.m. It was almost time to pick up Kevin from school. I leaned against my chair, staring at the spreadsheet on the screen in front of me, with the cacophony of voices, typing and ringing of phones surrounding me from the other cubicles. I still had some work to do, but I figured that I would call it a day. It was Friday, and I could wrap it up on Monday instead. I stood up, giving time to my lower back to adjust to the sudden shift of position. I put my keys in my pocket and turned off the computer, throwing a piece of crumpled up paper from my desk into the trash bin underneath. I rounded the corner, almost bumping into Katie. "Whoa, sorry about that." I stepped aside, smiling. "I'm going home already, Jack," she asked, clutching the folders to her chest and shooting me a grin. I took this as a sign that she wanted to strike some small talk and decided to indulge her. "Yeah, I gotta pick up my son from school. Rachel and I wanted to take him and his friends to laser tag today. You should probably call it a day soon too, you've been working like crazy lately." I leaned against the cubicle to my left. "Yeah, I know." Her expression turned sour. But I can't. Still gotta finish up a bunch of reports. Should be done by 5 p.m. now. I shook my head. You're a workaholic, you know that. She chuckled. All right, well, I'll see you Monday then. You have a great weekend, Katie. You too, Jack. She smiled and went her merry way, her heels resounding throughout the office with every step she took. I wondered for a moment how I had managed to almost bump into her, considering the fact that no matter how loud the other employees' voices were, Katie's high heels were ear-splittingly louder, regardless of where she was. You could basically pinpoint where she was at any given time just from that. I went into the bathroom and after relieving myself, went to the sink to wash my hands. As I did so, I glanced at my own reflection and stopped scrubbing out of surprise of what I saw. I looked like I hadn't slept in days. Heavy dark circles were beneath my eyes and my face. It looked like I hadn't shaved it in weeks, with gray hair sticking out here and there. And my hair was messy and greasy. Had I really come to work like that? I swiveled my head left and right, inspecting my face, baffled by my own looks. I had shaved that morning, and to the touch of the hand, my face was as smooth as a baby's butt, but in the reflection it looked scruffy and unkempt. I leaned in closer, inspecting every detail, amused and perplexed at what I was seeing. I smiled in order to see how I looked like that, and then I froze. My reflection in the mirror was frozen. I stepped back, bumping into the stall with my back, gasping and blinking violently, trying to make this hallucination go away. But when I opened my eyes again, the reflection was still frozen as it was a few seconds ago. I leaned left and then right, staring in amazement at what was in front of me. It felt like I was looking at my own Skype video while it was frozen during a call. I leaned in again, placing my palm on the cold glass, figuring that this may not have been a mirror after all. This has to be some kind of prank. A camera is somewhere in here, I thought to myself. I looked behind myself in the corners of the bathroom, still leaning against the mirror, and as I inspected the bathroom walls, I suddenly felt a strong grip on my wrist. I jerked my head back in the direction of the mirror, only to see my reflection had a furious look on his face. He was holding me by the wrist through the mirror so tightly that his knuckles were becoming white. I struggled to pull away from his grip, but before I could break free, he reached through the mirror with his other hand and grabbed me by the neck, pulling me closer. I tried screaming for help, but he squeezed too tightly, and all that came out was a barely audible gasp. He was pulling me closer by the second, and I could now smell the stale sweat and booze on his breath, so clearly that it only added to my asphyxiation. His face was merely inches away from mine now, and with one final effort, he jerked me towards himself with all his force. I closed my eyes, bracing myself for a crash with either my reflection's face or the mirror itself, but the impact never came, and instead I felt myself fall backwards onto my butt. When I opened my eyes, I realized that I was on the bathroom floor. I stood up as fast as I could with my back against the stall, my legs shaky, grabbing at my neck, which was still throbbing along with my wrist. I stared at my reflection in the mirror, seeing palpable fear in my own eyes. It no longer had the scruffy look, but resembled that of my real self from this morning. I stood there for what felt like a very long time, and when I saw that my reflection wasn't making any movements different than my own, I dumbly waved my hand in front of it. The reflection mirrored my own movement perfectly, putting me at ease a little bit. Just then, another employee walked inside, shooting me a suspicious glance before heading into one of the stalls. I collected myself, looking at the reflection one more time and tidying up before heading out. "You okay, Jack?" Katie asked me with a concerned look on her face. Yeah, Yeah, I nodded. Are you already done for the day? She asked. I frowned. Yeah, we talked about this a few minutes ago, remember? I gotta go pick up Kevin from school. Her look of concern changed to one of confusion now. She opened her mouth as if to say something and then closed it. Well, I should get back to work. She gave me a PR smile and left, her hurried footsteps echoing throughout the office. I left the office workspace and turned left down the hallway. See you Monday, Mark. I waved to a coworker who had passed by. You're going home? He turned around to face me. Yeah, you try not to work too hard either, okay? I turned to face him while backpedaling and then continued in the direction that I started. Jack. Mark called my name. When I looked back at him, he was standing in the middle of the hallway with the same concerned look on his face like Katie. Yeah? I asked, with a fake smile on my face. The elevator's this way. He pointed behind himself with his thumb. What are you talking about? That part is under renovation. See, the elevator's over. I turned around and pointed in the direction that I was originally facing and then stopped mid-sentence. At the far end of the hallway from wall to wall was a "Do Not Cross" tape, marking a clear border between the pristine floor and the one littered with dust and other powdery material. I started, staring at the tape and then turning back to Mark and looking behind his shoulder. Yeah, my bad, you're right. The exit is the other way. Are you feeling okay, Jack? Mark asked. Yeah, I just, got confused a little bit is all. I chuckled and waved my hand in dismissal. All right, man, well, you take care. I'll see you Monday. Mark forced a visibly fake smile and disappeared in the office space before I could even utter a "you too" properly. I looked back at the renovated area and then at the office door. What was going on today? First, the hallucination in the mirror, now forgetting where the elevator was. I had been working here for 2 years now, and there's no way the elevator could just switch places like that. Then again, I never went to the other side of this floor, so maybe there were 2 elevators and the main one was simply not functional. I shrugged those thoughts away and decided that I would take a nap as soon as I got back home. But the strange occurrences didn't stop there. On my way out of the building, I couldn't find my car at first, and it was only after the security guard came to ask what was going on that he was able to point me over to my car, all the way on the other side of the parking lot. I thanked him, probably looking like a madman to him, and made my way out of there. My son's school was close by, so I drove there. But when I arrived to my destination and parked my car, instead of the school being on my right, it was across the street. At this point, I started to worry a little bit. Had I suffered a head injury in the bathroom, and now all the information in my mind was jumbled up? My thoughts were interrupted when I glanced to my right and saw an old lady who was standing on the sidewalk, staring in my direction blankly. I ignored her and took off my seatbelt. I got out of the car and the sound of children's playful voices instantly filled the air, along with the occasional adults shouting warnings to the kids. I looked to the right and the old lady was still staring at me with her unrelenting gaze. I nodded to her, which she didn't respond. What is it with old people? I thought to myself and crossed the street, getting to the front of the school where children in large numbers were exiting the building and making their way home, some alone and some looking for their parents. I recognized some of Kevin's classmates and figured Kevin himself would be out at any moment. I waited a few minutes with my hands in my pocket, occasionally glancing at my watch. Then one of the adults came out. It was Mrs. Steiner, Kevin's teacher. I approached her, and when she looked up from her purse and caught my glance, she froze in place, staring at me with a blank expression on her face. "Mr. Conley," she said, "is there something that I can help you with?" Yeah," I said, surprised that I even needed to explain. I made her pick up Kevin as he stood inside. Her blank expression changed to that of a serious concern. She stared at me for a few seconds before saying, "Are you here to pick up some of Kevin's belongings? Did he leave anything at school?" "No, what? No. I'm here for Kevin." At this point, I was probably as confused as she was. "I think you need to leave now, Mr. Conley," she responded after a pause. "And I strongly believe you should get some help." She took a step forward, but I got in her way. "What? What are you talking about? Just tell me where Kevin is. Did something happen to him?" I insisted, furious and scared. She sighed. "I know the truth is hard to accept, and I'm so sorry that you had to go through that. But if you come here again, I'll be forced to call security." She tried to leave again, but I grabbed her by the arm, attracting these suspicious glances of some kids and adults nearby. Mrs. Steiner jerked her head in my direction. She looked like she was ready to pepper spray me by this moment. I let go of her arm, realizing suddenly that I was being too violent. "Mrs. Steiner, please, just tell me what happened to Kevin. Was he in an accident? Is he all right?" I pleaded. She stared at me for a moment as if to contemplate what she should do, and then she said, "Mr. Conley, I'm sorry, but your son died 6 months ago." "Is this a joke?" I shouted louder than I intended, attracting more glares around me. Mrs. Steiner was clearly shocked but said nothing. "Where's Kevin?" I demanded. "Kevin! Kevin!" I frenetically spun around looking for my son, completely disregarding the scared kids and parents who were holding their children close to themselves and evacuating the school. "Mr. Conley, please," Mrs. Steiner interjected, but I ignored her, calling Kevin's name over and over. "Where's Kevin? Where's my son?" I paced back and forth around the schoolyard, while people were avoiding me in a large arch. 2 security guards rushed in, and before I knew it, I was forcefully being dragged out. Their pleas for me to leave, which later turned into threats about calling the police, they fell on deaf ears as I kept trying to find Kevin. I ended up being thrown out, and when I tried to get back in, they blocked my path. "Please, I have to find my son." I tried to get past the guards, unable to control my panic. "Sir, I'm warning you, if you don't leave right now, I'll be forced to call the authorities." He put his palm on my chest and pushed me back. I finally snapped my full attention to him, and with hesitation, I returned to my car. I had to call my wife Amanda. She would assure me that everything was okay, right? I mean, she had to. I whipped out my phone, scrolling through my contacts. I dialed her phone number, glancing out the car window in the direction of the guards who hadn't budged from their location. They were still shooting me suspicious looks, probably waiting for me to leave. I waited for Amanda's phone to start ringing, but it never came. I looked at the screen and saw that the call had been disconnected. I dialed again, but the same thing happened. I slammed the phone on the steering wheel out of frustration and put it back in my pocket. She was home, so I had to go there. Maybe she already picked Kevin up and this was all an elaborate prank. I remember hoping against hope that that was the case. I put the keys in the ignition and started up my car. I drove off with screeching tires, probably attracting the glances of even more people along the way. It took everything in my power not to run all the red lights on the way home, but I knew it in my hot-headed state that being pulled over by the police would only exacerbate the situation. When I finally pulled up in front of my house, I got out of the car so fast that the seatbelt initially pulled me back. I slammed the car door and strode to the entrance, forcefully trying to open the door. It was locked. I put my keys inside, but they didn't fit for some reason. I rang the bell and then knocked 3 times, loudly shouting, "Amanda, are you home?" The sound of a key turning was heard on the other end and the door opened. But it wasn't Amanda. In front of me stood my neighbor Nick. "Jack, is everything okay?" he asked worriedly, holding the door with one hand. As soon as I glanced behind my neighbor inside his home, I realized what a huge error I'd made. I was looking at my neighbor's home and not my own. "I'm so sorry, Nick. Drinking already, Jack." He smiled and tried to shrug it off as a joke. I chuckled nervously. "Yeah, sorry about the disturbance. Hope I didn't interrupt anything." "And don't worry about it, buddy. Take it easy now, will ya?" "Yeah, you too." I smiled and turned around across the street where my home actually was. I approached the door and tried to open it. Locked. I pulled out my keys and hesitantly put them in, and sure enough, they fit like a glove. I pushed the door gently, revealing the dim interior. What I saw inside was my home, and yet it wasn't. The foyer floor had my shoes scattered all over the floor. Amanda always made sure the foyer was tidy and the shoes were organized, so this looked like she had been away for a while. There was dirt on the floor, indicating that whoever had gone in hadn't bothered to wipe their shoes first. The living room had barely any sunlight gleaming through. I shut the door, further decreasing the natural light inside. "Amanda, Kevin," I shouted and held my breath, waiting for a response or any noise. None came. I went inside the living room and again was faced with the feeling of surrealism at what I saw. Everything was exactly how I had left it this morning, but some things were off. There were discarded booze bottles on the table, and under it some flipped over, the contents spilled and dried on the carpet. There were grease-stained papers and bags from fast food all over the place. What happened here? Amanda's crazy about keeping the place as clean as an operating room, so to have her leave it like this indicated that something was very wrong here. I approached the table and saw that there was a flipped-over photo next to a half-eaten burger. I picked it up and inspected it. It was a picture of Kevin. I stared at it and suppressed the tears welling up in my eyes. I was confused by everything and scared. Scared for myself and for my wife and son. I was afraid that I would never get to see them or hear their voices again. Just then I heard a vibration in front of me, and moving the food papers away, I saw a cell phone. It was my own cell phone, no doubt about it. I unlocked it, revealing dozens of missed calls and messages. Most of the messages were people asking me where I was and if I was alright. As I scrolled through, I saw that some messages were from Amanda. The first thing that struck me as odd and confirmed my suspicions was the fact that she was in my contacts simply under the name Amanda rather than wife. I read her messages as fast as I could. "Jack, are you okay? Hey, call me back when you get this. Why aren't you answering? I'm starting to worry." There were missed calls from her as well. I called her number and waited for the phone to ring. After just one ring, she picked up. "Jack, is that you?" Her voice resounded on the other end. "Amanda, yeah, it's me. Where are you?" "Where am I? Where are you? Do you know how long you've been gone? Your disappearance was filed to the police and they're looking for you." "What?" "Amanda, listen, I don't know what's going on, but where's Kevin? I went to pick him up from school and then everything just got jumbled up. Mrs. Steiner said that he's dead. Amanda, what's going on here, and where's our son?" I heard Amanda sigh over the phone. "Jack, I think you should get help. Listen, I have to go. It's best we..." "Amanda, please, can you please just talk about this? I don't know what's going on and I feel like I'm losing my mind. I can't remember anything, please." There was silence over the phone, and then she said, "I'll be there in 20 minutes, but I don't have much time." "Thank you." I hung up and stared at nothing for a while. Would I finally get some answers when she arrived? In the meantime, I decided that I should check the rest of the house out. I went up the stairs and into the bedroom. It was almost as messy as the living room, with bottles of liquor on the nightstand and on the floor. Dirty clothes were piled up in the corner of the room and the bed sheets were hanging off the side of the bed. The curtains were draped over the windows, dimming the room entirely. The whole room reeked of booze and sweat. I noticed that all of Amanda's belongings had been removed from the room and only mine remained. Before I exited, I noticed some meds on the night table next to the half-emptied liquor bottle, antidepressants and sleeping pills. I left the room and closed the door, immediately eliminating the odor coming from inside. I went down the hallway and slowly approached the door on the right. I grabbed the knob and hesitated. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open, revealing the interior of the room. Kevin's room was exactly how I remembered it. Everything was in place and tidy, contrasting the rest of the house's mess. His bed was made and school books rested upon the desk facing the window. Sunlight gleamed inside, like a sanctuary of light from the darkness in the house. The TV screen reflected dust from sunlight, and on the floor below was his console with a single game neatly resting atop it. I looked around, absorbing my surroundings, inexplicable sadness suddenly overcoming me. "Where are you, Kevin? What happened to you?" Tears welled up in my eyes again, and I turned around before I could allow myself to start crying, and closed the door firmly. If I could, I would build a wall over the door, just so that I wouldn't have to look at it again and be painfully reminded of my loss. And before I could process that thought clearly, I heard the doorbell ring. I ran down the stairs as fast as I could and opened the door, letting in a gust of fresh air. "Hello, Jack." Amanda looked horrible. Her hair was unkempt and she had heavy bags under her eyes. Her skin was pale and she looked like she had lost a ton of weight. "Amanda," I said dumbly, staring at her. I hadn't even thought about how I should behave when she arrives. Do I hug her? Do I act friendly? According to what I knew, we seemed to be living apart, so I had to test the waters first. "Can I come in?" she asked. Yeah, sure." I snapped back to reality and stepped aside, letting her in. She took off her shoes, glancing at the dirty foyer along the way, and then went straight to the living room. I knew she was probably disgusted by the mess in front of her. "Sorry about the mess," I said. It's all right," she said, standing uncomfortably in the middle of the room. I cleared the table and sat on the couch, telling her to feel free to do the same. She sat opposite me and looked around at the room once more. "Amanda, I have a lot of questions." I swallowed and leaned in, jumping into the topic right away. "Likewise. You disappeared a week ago. Where did you go?" She looked at me judgmentally. "I have no idea what you're talking about. Listen, I was at work just now and I know it doesn't make sense, but I was supposed to pick up Kevin from school and we had plans for the weekend for him and his friends. I finished work earlier and all of a sudden everything got confusing. Mrs. Steiner said that he died when I went to pick him up and I don't. A laser tag." "What?" "We were gonna take him and his friends to laser tag." Amanda smiled. "Yes, that's it. I went to pick him up and everything else was just a mess. Nothing is where I remember it to be and people look at me strangely. I don't get it." "Jack, that was 6 months ago. That was the day Kevin died." I stared, dumbfounded. I had somehow traveled 6 months into the future and completely forgot about everything during that time. Amanda continued. "Jack, this is clearly a coping mechanism. You suppressed everything from that day on to deal with Kevin's death. I understand it, but you need help. You can't run from this." How did he die?" She stared at me and her expression turned from judgmental to hateful. "You killed him, Jack," she said through her teeth. The next few days were a blur. I spent the majority of my days drinking and sleeping. I kept replaying the conversation with Amanda in my mind over and over. You killed Kevin, Jack. No, that can't be true, you're lying. It's true, Jack. You were speeding and the car brakes didn't work and you survived unscathed, but Kevin, there was barely anything left of him. She started crying. No, no! I grabbed my head, pacing around, feeling like my heart was going to explode. It was an accident, Jack. You didn't mean to kill him. But I never forgave you. I exhaled sharply, wiping my tears. So you decided to leave me? I asked. I had to get away. The house brought too many painful memories for me, and you were in your own world as well, drinking yourself unconscious daily, and I had to get away from it all. I wish I could say that Amanda and I had a recollection and that she forgave me, but by the time she left, we were both heavy-hearted and tired from crying. I had no strength to ask her to stay, even though I wanted her to be with me through such a difficult time. I saw the resentment in her eyes and knew better than to ask. I hated myself for ruining our family, and I hated myself for not remembering my child's death. I knew it was probably poetic justice for me to go through this pain for the second time, but I begged God to take it away. The pain was so excruciating and exhausting that I even contemplated ending my life with pills. And then 3 days after my meetup with Amanda, I woke up at 3 p.m. with a hangover and went into the bathroom to clean myself up. I looked in the mirror and saw what an empty husk I'd become. My hair was messy, my beard unkempt and scruffy, the bags under my bloodshot eyes adding to my age, and I didn't care about it though. I bent down to wash my face, and when I stood up, I sobered up immediately at what I saw. In front of me was my own reflection, and yet it wasn't my own. The person in front of me looked clean and tidy with a perfectly shaved face, a healthier skin tone, and neat hair. Suddenly I remembered what had transpired at my work bathroom a few days ago. I had been grieving and completely misplaced it from my mind. I stared at my reflection and its lack of blemishes, and my anger boiled. I was angrier than I had ever been before in my life. It was this reckless monster who took everything from me, and I hated him for that. I wanted nothing more than to reach into the mirror and bash his head over the sink and over until his bloody, unrecognizable pulp remained. This urge was so irresistible that I felt myself unwillingly raising my head and diving into the mirror, grabbing the wrist of the other Jack with force I never knew that I had. My reflection suddenly looked scared for his life, and it fed into my satisfaction of wanting to hurt him. I reached with my other hand as well and grabbed him by the neck, squeezing tightly. I started pulling him towards me, with the intention of dragging him over to my side and brutally murdering him. I yanked him with all my might, and just before he uncontrollably crashed into me, I felt myself stumbling backwards. I stood up, looking at my reflection, ready to grab him once more, but he was gone. Just my own dirty reflection remained. I sighed at leaving the bathroom and heading into the bedroom, stumbling onto my bed face first. "Honey, is everything okay?" I heard a voice which put all my senses on edge. Had I imagined that? "Honey," the voice repeated, a familiar, soothing voice. It was Amanda. I rushed downstairs, practically jumping down the last 5 steps, and sure enough, there she was. But not the Amanda that I saw a few days ago, but my Amanda as I knew her before. Beautiful, happy, and perfect. "Jack, what happened to you?" She looked at me with confusion. "Is this a costume or something? You're Jack the hobo now," she chuckled. I stared at her in bafflement. My brain could not process what I was seeing. "Jack?" She shot me a suspicious glance. Yeah," I asked. "Are you gonna pick up Kevin or not? He's almost done in school." I opened my mouth dumbly and then closed it, muttering a weak, "What?" "Your son Kevin, you're supposed to pick him up. He has laser tag today, remember?" She repeated. Right. I ran for my keys, feeling a surge of ecstasy overwhelming me. I'm supposed to pick up Kevin, that's right. Jack, wait. Amanda started, but I was already in the car. The urge to run the red lights was even stronger than last time, but I resisted it, especially since I knew that I was responsible for Kevin's death by driving. The school was not where I remembered it to be, though. It wasn't across the street this time either. It was all the way on the other end of the street. This raised some suspicions with me, but I ignored them. I didn't care. Kevin was alive, and that's all that mattered. I ran to the school and didn't even need to look. There he was, just how I remembered him the day that he left for school when I last saw him. He smiled widely when he saw me and ran to me. I embraced him tightly, telling him how much I missed him and that I would never let him go. When I finally let him go, holding back tears of joy, he simply wrinkled his nose and said, Dad, you stink." I laughed, kissing him on the forehead, and pretty soon he and I were on the way to the car. As I let him in and closed the door, I heard a voice behind me. "Don't do it." I turned around and it was the same old lady that I saw a few days ago in the same spot, the one who was staring at me from the pavement. "He's not your son, Jack." She shook her head. "You know that well. You're taking someone else's son. Don't do it." I scoffed. I was caught by surprise so suddenly that it took me a moment to respond. "Listen, lady, I don't know who you think you are, but you need to mind your own business, all right? Now, if you'll excuse me. You're not in your own world. Your son is alive and there's still time to save him, you just..." "All right, that's enough," I yelled and rushed inside the car, ignoring Kevin's worried gaze as we sped out of there. "Are you okay, Dad?" Kevin asked. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw that the old lady was still staring at me. "Yeah, I'm fine, buddy. You ready to kick some butt in laser tag?" I asked, much to his enthusiasm. A few minutes later, we pulled up in front of the house and Amanda was standing in front of the entrance smiling. "Oh, there you are," she said. "Did your dad drive recklessly?" Kevin looked at me and I shook my head, winking at him. "All right, let's get you inside. Lunch is ready," Amanda said. I stared at them, the two people who meant everything to me in the world, and I suddenly got the instinctive urge to turn around. As I did, there she was across the street, the old lady from school. She stood there, our gazes meeting. She shook her head slowly, and I sighed and looked back at Amanda taking off Kevin's backpack, as he was telling her about something that happened at school. I could just live with my family even if it was fake and nobody would ever know the difference. I glanced at the old lady again. "Hey Amanda, do you think that you could take Kevin to laser tag? I have something to take care of." "What now? But this was your idea. I thought you wanted to do this." "I know when I do, and I'll be there later, I promise." I approached Amanda and put my hands on her face, kissing her gently. I knelt down and ruffled Kevin's hair, saying, "You listen to your mom now, all right?" As I opened the car door, I looked at them one more time. "You promise, Dad. Don't be late, and we're getting pizza later," Kevin said, smiling widely. "Yeah, otherwise we'll have to go on without you." Amanda smiled along with him, ushering him inside. I smiled back bitterly and watched until the door closed behind. I looked at the old lady and she was still staring at me. I did a U-turn and stopped the car in front of her. "Get in," I said to the old lady after rolling the window down. She got in, smiling for the first time since I saw her. "I knew you would make the right call, Jack," she said. "Who are you really and how do you know me?" I asked, putting my cup of coffee on the table. The cafe that we were in had a plethora of young people in it, filling the interior with their voices, allowing the old lady and me to talk in peace. "I know everything about you, Jack. I know what you've been through lately, the strange events that took place in the mirrors. You know about that." "Yes, and that's why I'm here. What is done has to be undone. You probably figured it out by now. Most of it anyway. I shook my head confused. I glanced at the other tables to make sure that nobody was eavesdropping, even though the topic of our conversation would most likely just have people dismiss us as lunatics even if they heard something. I still felt like a student who was cheating on an exam and afraid of being caught. All I know is strange things started happening a few days ago and I feel like I'm losing my mind. Nothing is where it's supposed to be. I went to pick up my son and the school was across the street. I went home and it was my neighbor's house. It's like, I trailed off. Like you've entered a mirror. She finished my sentence, a blank expression on her face. Yeah, and then my son was dead and my wife and I were divorced. What's going on here exactly? She leans back in her chair, never breaking eye contact. You switched places with the Jack from a different mirrorverse. Mirrorverse? You mean multiverse? No, I mean mirrorverse. That's what the scientists call it. Similar to the multiverse, there are worlds out there. Millions and millions of infinite worlds. All the same and all different. You've seen them. I stared at her, expecting her to continue. Jack, being able to travel from one world to another is an extremely rare gift, but for some reason you seem to have it. You're able to see into those worlds and even enter them, but going in and out is not good. Why? Why is it not good? I was sitting on the edge of my seat, proudly wide-eyed, while she looked like she was talking about something nonchalant like recipes for cooking. She continued. It creates an imbalance. It creates distortions and paradoxes in other worlds. We can't allow that to happen. The mirrorverse where Kevin is dead, Jack got his son killed in an accident. It may have happened a million other times to a million other Kevins, but none of them would have the impact and balance like that specific one. He's the starting point of everything. I took a sip of my coffee, giving fluid to my dry throat. She inhaled and continued. It may have happened to a million other Jacks, but they would simply mourn Kevin's death and move on. Some of them would stay in an unhappy marriage and some would get divorced, and most of them would commit suicide or die from alcohol or drug abuse. But not this Jack. He couldn't come to terms with what he did. So one day he accidentally saw you in the mirror, a version of himself which still had a happy family, and he was overtaken by anger. He hated himself, so he tried to kill you and inadvertently switched places with you and then realized that Kevin was alive in your world. So he wants a world where Kevin is still alive and Amanda is with him. He wants to have a happy family again. For a moment I felt pity and understanding for my imposter. She shook her head. Not exactly. He's lost his mind. He believes that his son was taken from him. He can't cope with the fact that he lost his own son, and he hates himself for it so much that he wants to punish every version of himself in every world. How? By killing Kevin in all the worlds. What? My shout attracted a few glances for a moment. He wants to punish all the Jacks in all the worlds by taking the most precious thing away from them. But we switched worlds days ago. Oh God, if he picked up Kevin then. Your son is still alive, but we don't have much time, Jack. I felt a surge of panic coursing through my entire body like electricity. I have to go and save Kevin. Now. Don't worry, he's still okay. And we still have time to save him. She reassured me after noticing my fear, and I know exactly where to find him. The panic that I felt before started to abate and I leaned in my chair, scratching my beard, looking at the old lady. All these things just seemed so far-fetched. Different worlds and mirrors which you can travel through, having millions of doppelgangers out there. This all seemed like a movie script and I never even stopped to ask myself if I was maybe losing my mind. Maybe this lady was just as crazy as I was and was feeding into my illusion. Everything she said made sense, but somehow it was still hard to believe. "Who are you, lady?" I asked. She shrugged. "Just a guardian. I try to keep a balance in all the mirrorverses. That is and always was my duty." "So why can't you do something about this? Can't you just return us all to our own worlds or something?" She shook her head. "No, Jack, I can't meddle in these affairs. I can offer assistance, but you must be the one to restore balance." "And what happens to the Jack I switched places with today? For all we know, there could be hundreds or thousands of others who did the same. The first Jack may have started an infinite loop," I said. "It all begins and ends with the Jack who took your life away. Once you do what must be done, everything will return to normal and balance will be restored. He can't be allowed to cause any more damage. He has to be stopped." "What is it that I must do? How do I stop him?" I turned my palms towards her in an asking manner, getting impatient. She leaned in so that we were so close to each other that I could see every pore in her face, her unrelenting gaze locked with mine. "You must kill him, Jack," she whispered. "It is the only way." I sat in the car holding a mirror in my lap. The old lady was next to me. The sunny day slowly turned into a gray one, bringing with it the droplets of rain which resounded on the roof of my car. "I don't understand what I'm supposed to do here." I shook my head, looking at the lady. I felt like a teenager in a driving test and she was the instructor, but unlike my actual instructor, she was very patient. "Stare directly in the mirror," she said. "Now what do you see?" I stared at my face, shaking my head once more. "Myself?" I said, unsure. "Good, now try to remember what the first Jack looked like. Remember what he did to you and how he took your life away. And once you start feeling an overwhelming emotion, either sadness, anger, hate, or such, reach into the mirror. Try it." I glanced at the mirror and then felt her hand on my shoulder. "Remember, no matter what happens, you must kill him. Otherwise, this was all for nothing." I stared at the mirror once more, trying to remember the Jack in the work bathroom mirror. He looked back then very much like I did now. Messy hair, unkempt beard, pale face but more so, and I distinctly remember smelling booze on his breath. The anger that I felt earlier toward him was gone and was instead replaced by profound sadness which a father who lost his child could understand. I saw my own reflection changing, hair and beard slightly growing and bags under the eyes becoming heavier. Without further thinking, I slowly and gently reached into the mirror. I felt the cold glass touching my knuckles as the mirror stopped my hand from going through. I dropped the mirror back into my lap and shook my head in frustration. "I don't think this is gonna work." When I looked to my right, the old lady was gone. I looked around and saw her nowhere in the streets. A few people were walking by with umbrellas, but that was it. I then realized that I was on the other side of the street, or rather the street was inverted. I knew immediately that I was back in my own world. I started the car and slowly drove off. The lady said that they would be at the corner of this one street that sold video games at exactly 5:12. I felt my jacket to see if my gun was still there, very careful not to somehow lose it along the way. I had to sneak into the house while Amanda and Kevin were gone to retrieve it, and I did not feel content by having to use it, let alone kill someone. But in the end, my son's life was at stake. Knots started twisting in my stomach, anxiety like before a big test or presentation, and with each mile I got closer, it only got worse. I tried to keep Kevin's face in my mind's eye in order to prevent myself from chickening out, in case I really had to pull the trigger. I arrived at my destination soon and parked the car further away to avoid suspicion from the other Jack. It was 5:05. The street was empty and the sounds of occasional cars driving across the wet roads were heard in the adjacent streets. The video game store at the corner was the one where I would regularly take Kevin to buy him games, so I kept a close eye on it. 5:12. Two people emerged from the shop. An adult man and a child. Jack and Kevin. It was surreal seeing myself with my son there, as if I was watching a hyper-realistic movie. Kevin had a smile on his face and was pointing to the game in his hands, telling Jack something. My doppelganger listened closely, saying something in return, smiling equally. He looked a lot healthier and cleaner than last time. Seeing them together like that, this imposter with my son, made anger surge through me and all feelings of anxiety were gone. This was my time to shine. I stepped forward on the pavement towards them. They hadn't seen me yet. "Jack!" I called out to my copy and saw his smile drop when he realized who he was looking at. Kevin seemed perplexed as well, looking at the both of us, wildly swiveling his head left and right. Without a word, Jack picked up Kevin and started running. "Stop!" I shouted, sprinting after them. They ran around the corner and disappeared into the crowd of people in front. I pushed my way through the herd, much to the cursing and frustration of them. Jack was running straight towards a police officer, so he turned inside a nearby building. He could have just told the cop there was a crazy man with a gun after him, but I guess he panicked. Also, he didn't know that I had a gun on me. I followed closely, and when I went inside, they were gone. The light above the elevator was on though, and it showed that they were going to the top floor. I was already exhausted from running, but decided that I had no choice but to run 10 floors up. I climbed the stairs as fast as I could, making sure along the way the elevator wasn't stopping or changing directions. When I finally arrived, I saw them exiting the door that leads to the roof. Thank God for slow elevators, I thought to myself and followed them. I felt the cold air and droplets on my face once more and immediately looked for my son. Jack and Kevin stood at the edge of the roof, Kevin scared and Jack wide-eyed, panicking. "You can't have him," he shouted, holding my son's hand firmly. "Dad, no," Kevin cried, looking at the evil Jack. "It's okay, Kevin, everything's going to be okay," I shouted over the sudden wind which became strong. I slowly stepped closer. "Stay back," he shouted, pulling Kevin closer and taking one step towards the edge. "This has to end, Jack," I said, taking another step closer. "You don't understand. You can't understand what I've been through." "Oh, I do understand, Jack. I know what happened and I felt the same pain that you did when you lost Kevin. The brakes didn't work and the car crashed. It wasn't your fault, Jack." He looked down and then at Kevin. He looked like he was on the verge of tears. "I'm sorry, he started. "Hey, it's okay, it's not too late, but you have to stop this. Kevin did nothing wrong, you need to let him go." Jack looked at Kevin and he knelt down in front of him. He hugged him and said, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean for all this to happen. You mean the world to me and I let you down." He let go and stood up. Kevin stepped back and they shared a moment of exchanged glances. Then a loud bang echoed on the roof. Jack looked down at his chest and saw a red stain which increased by the second, and then he glanced at me. I lowered my gun, my hands shaking so hard that I could barely hold it. Jack looked at Kevin before he simply collapsed on his back with his eyes still open. Kevin screamed and I rushed to embrace him. I comforted him as I watched Jack's body fade before me, and I wondered if this outcome was really necessary. The rest of the day was a blur. I was just happy to have Kevin back and knew that despite the trauma he had just been through, he would be okay. Amanda insisted that he had a bad dream and that seeing two Jacks wasn't possible. I agreed with her and comforted my son. That night I put Kevin to sleep in his room and I tucked him in and he looked at me and said, Dad, I once had a similar dream to the one today. I smiled. Oh yeah, was it scary? I don't know, you were fighting with your twin and I woke up before it ended. Oh, don't worry, if my evil twin does come, I'll kick his butt. Just then, Amanda came to the door. Jack, there's somebody at the door, she said. It's for you. It was 10 p.m. already, so I wondered who it could be, but I had some idea. When I opened the door, sure enough, the old lady was there. I wasn't really glad to see her, but at the same time, I was really grateful for what she did for me. "I've got 5 minutes for a walk, Jack?" she asked. I nodded. I closed the door behind me and followed her down the street. "Well, you did it, Jack. You got your life back." "Yeah, but was killing him really necessary?" I asked. "I'm afraid so. Payment was required." "Payment? What do you mean?" She stopped and turned towards me. "Jack, I haven't been fully honest with you. When the Jack you killed had started messing with the Mirrorverse, he did some irreversible damage, and payment was required. Balance had to be restored. The Jack who took your son didn't start a killing spree, and it never was his intention. I lied about that. He simply wanted a life where he would have his son back. But you said, oh, I know, if I had told you the truth, you never would have done what needed to be done." She paced around. "This was the only way." "But that's not all, Jack." I stared at her in silence, the feeling of dread forming at the pit of my stomach once more. She continued, "When you killed Jack today, you started an unstoppable cycle. In exactly 6 months, a Jack from one of the Mirrorverses will enter your world and kill you." I widened my eyes, opening my mouth, ready to interject, but she interrupted. "You can't stop it, Jack, I'm sorry. A life was traded for a life, and I know how miserable you would have been without your son. So I did you a favor and traded your life for Kevin's. Don't you think that's fair?" I didn't even know how to start processing this. I opened my mouth dumbly once more and then closed it, swallowing spit through my dry throat. I looked down at my shoes and listened as she continued. "I suggest you spend your remaining time with your family. Don't travel through mirrors anymore, for I fear the damage could be even greater this time. Live the rest of your life to the fullest. And Jack," I looked up at her to see her smiling. "Thank you," she said as she turned around and disappeared into thin air.